In this video, we're going to be breaking every single time every SpongeBob character was terrified. Let's get started. First, we got Graveyard Shift, one of SpongeBob's most memorable horror-themed episodes that shows how a simple prank can spiral completely out of control. This episode takes the innocent world of Bikini Bottom and transforms it into something genuinely creepy, all because Squidward wanted to mess with SpongeBob during their first night shift at the Krusty Krab. The whole situation starts when Mr. Krabs decides to keep the Krusty Krab open 24 hours a day after seeing potential customers with money at closing time, while Mr. Krabs heads home. Leaving SpongeBob and Squidward to handle the night shift alone, SpongeBob becomes incredibly excited about working through the night. He runs around the restaurant doing his usual tasks, but adding "at night" to everything he says, which quickly drives Squidward to his breaking point. The tension builds when Squidward sends SpongeBob to take out the trash, hoping for some peace and quiet. SpongeBob hesitates at the door when he sees how dark it is outside, but forces himself to run to the dumpster anyway. When he returns acting tough about conquering his fear, Squidward sees an opportunity to get revenge for all the annoying "at night" comments. He starts telling SpongeBob about something terrible that happened at the restaurant, claiming he probably shouldn't mention it because it would ruin the night shift experience. Squidward then launches into the elaborate story of the hash-slinging slasher, describing a former fry cook who accidentally cut off his own hand while making patties, replaced it with a rusty spatula, got hit by a bus, and was fired at his own funeral. According to the story, this ghost returns every Tuesday night to get revenge. Squidward explains the 3 warning signs: flickering lights, a phone call with nobody there, and the ghost arriving on the same bus that killed him. He builds up the suspense perfectly, describing how the ghost taps on the window, opens the door, and approaches the counter before getting his victims. SpongeBob completely falls for the story, screaming for about 20 seconds while his pupils even start screaming too. The prank works so well that Squidward has to shout over SpongeBob's continued screaming to explain that he was joking and none of it was real. SpongeBob then switches to laughing just as intensely, which annoys Squidward all over again. Later that night, the restaurant becomes eerily quiet with Squidward reading at the register while SpongeBob cleans the ceiling. When Squidward complains about the place being like a ghost town, the lights suddenly start flickering on and off. He initially thinks SpongeBob is pulling a prank based on his earlier story, but realizes nobody is touching the light switch. Then the phone rings with nobody on the other end, followed by the walls oozing green slime, which Squidward dismisses since they always do that anyway. The real terror begins when a bus pulls up outside and drops off a mysterious figure across the street. The silhouette lifts what appears to be a spatula, causing Squidward to panic and struggle to remember the name Hash-Slinging Slasher. SpongeBob initially thinks Squidward dressed up to entertain him, but Squidward points out the obvious flaw in that theory. When the figure taps on the window and enters the restaurant, both SpongeBob and Squidward cling to each other in absolute terror, with SpongeBob even confessing he used Squidward's clarinet to unclog his toilet. The climax reveals the ghost is actually just a nervous green fish named Richard who wants a job application. He brought his own spatula, called earlier but hung up due to nerves, and took the bus to get there. Just when everything seems resolved and the mystery is solved, the lights flicker again, leading everyone to discover that Nosferatu has been the one flicking the light switch all along. The vampire simply smiles and turns off the lights, ending the episode on this absurd note. The episode shows how fear and imagination can completely distort reality, turning innocent coincidences into terrifying omens. What started as Squidward's mean-spirited prank backfired spectacularly when real events began matching his fictional story, creating genuine terror for both characters until the anticlimactic but hilarious truth emerged. But while Squidward's fake ghost story eventually got resolved with laughs, SpongeBob's next encounter with nighttime terror would prove far more destructive to his daily life. Nightlight, an episode that shows how SpongeBob's fear of darkness becomes so extreme that it nearly destroys his entire neighborhood. What starts as simple bedtime reading turns into a psychological breakdown that attracts superheroes and arch-villains to Bikini Bottom. The whole situation begins when SpongeBob reads a horror novel about ancient crypts and monsters so terrifying that the author died writing about them. After finishing the book, SpongeBob tries to convince himself and Gary that scary stories are just fiction, but the moment he turns off his bedroom light, his imagination runs wild. Every shadow becomes a monster, every sound becomes a threat, and even his own furniture transforms into terrifying creatures in the darkness. Gary becomes so frightened by the story that he literally stiffens with fear and falls over, showing that even SpongeBob's pet can sense the genuine terror building in their home. The fear builds throughout the night as SpongeBob keeps switching his light on and off, seeing monsters that turn out to be his inflatable chair and coral branches floating outside his window. Each time he thinks he's conquered his fear by identifying the innocent objects, another sound or shadow sends him back into panic mode. The knocking on his window from the coral branch particularly terrifies him, and the creaking sounds of his house settling become evidence of supernatural visitors. He gets no sleep whatsoever, turning what should have been a peaceful night into a marathon of terror that leaves him completely exhausted. By morning, SpongeBob arrives at work looking absolutely destroyed, with bloodshot eyes, a 5 o'clock shadow, and complete exhaustion written all over his face. Mr. Krabs immediately notices something wrong with his usually energetic employee, but SpongeBob tries to brush off his appearance as just having a rough night. The moment he enters the kitchen, chaos erupts as SpongeBob runs around in circles with a pot on his head, screaming about getting the darkness off of him. When Mr. Krabs removes the pot, SpongeBob discovers an even worse problem that pushes his fear to completely irrational levels. At the Krusty Krab, SpongeBob's fear reaches dangerous new levels when he realizes that even blinking creates the terrifying darkness he's trying to avoid. Every time his eyelids close, even for a split second, he sees nothing but the black void that terrifies him. He tries using French fries to prop his eyelids open in a desperate attempt to stay in constant light, but the fries snap under the pressure and send him back into screaming fits. When Mr. Krabs orders him to get patties from the dark walk-in cooler, SpongeBob sees what appears to be a sinister face, laughing in the shadows, and completely loses control, clinging to the ceiling and screaming about being saved from the darkness. Mr. Krabs immediately realizes that SpongeBob's fear is affecting business profits and suggests buying a nightlight to solve the problem. The solution seems simple enough, and SpongeBob heads to Bargain Mart that evening wearing his pajamas and nightcap, desperately searching for the perfect nightlight. When he finds the wall display of colorful nightlights, he picks one that he considers beautiful and asks the store clerk if they're guaranteed to keep creepy creatures away. The clerk's sarcastic response about leaving sooner shows how obvious SpongeBob's desperation has become. SpongeBob rushes home and plugs in his first nightlight, feeling relieved that he can finally see his room with the gentle blue glow. But after getting into bed, he immediately realizes his bathroom is still dark and scary, sending him back to the store in a panic. This triggers an endless cycle of buying more and more nightlights, as SpongeBob discovers that every dark corner and shadow requires its own illumination. He makes multiple trips to Bargain Mart, each time finding another area of his house that needs light coverage, from his closet to his hallway to every possible nook and cranny. The situation escalates completely out of control when SpongeBob decides he needs nightlights everywhere, including inside his medicine cabinet, under his refrigerator, in his toilet, and even attached to Gary's shell as a taillight. His living room becomes covered with millions of nightlights, creating a wall of illumination that eliminates every possible square inch of darkness. But even this extreme measure doesn't satisfy SpongeBob's paranoia, as he realizes that darkness still exists inside his own head. He responds by sticking 2 flashlights directly into his eye sockets, creating such an intense glow that his entire pineapple house becomes visible from space. The massive light display creates serious problems for the neighborhood, particularly for Squidward, whose windows focus the light into laser beams that burn his eyes to a crisp while he's trying to sleep. But the real consequences begin when Patrick notices the glow and assumes SpongeBob is throwing a party without him. Patrick becomes so terrified of the darkness outside that he literally moves his entire rock into SpongeBob's house, crashing through the wall and creating a gaping hole that lets in the very darkness they're trying to avoid. But SpongeBob's quest for complete illumination attracts serious consequences when the massive light display accidentally summons Mermaid Man and Barnacle Boy, who mistake the glow for their emergency signal. The elderly superheroes struggle to reach SpongeBob's house, with Mermaid Man complaining about how difficult it is to move at their advanced age and warning SpongeBob never to shine giant lights in the sky unless there's a real emergency. Even worse, the lights also draw the attention of the Moth, described as Mermaid Man's most dangerous arch-nemesis, who has been missing for 57 years. When SpongeBob tries to help by trapping the Moth inside his lighthouse with all the light it craves, the plan backfires spectacularly as the powerful villain pushes up the entire lighthouse and flies away with SpongeBob's house attached. The Moth cackles wickedly as he disappears into the distance, promising to see them again in another 57 years, leaving SpongeBob and Patrick completely homeless and surrounded by the darkness they feared most. Only when dawn arrives and the sun provides natural illumination do they finally find peace, though Patrick's attempt to retrieve the sun results in him getting burned by too much light. The episode demonstrates how irrational fears can escalate into destructive obsessions that end up causing the very problems they were meant to prevent. SpongeBob's simple fear of darkness transformed into a neighborhood-threatening light pollution crisis that attracted supervillains and destroyed his home, proving that sometimes the cure really can be worse than the disease. While SpongeBob's obsession with nightlights caused chaos from the outside, his next mental breakdown would come from being pushed too hard at his beloved workplace. Fear of a Krabby Patty shows how even SpongeBob's legendary work ethic has its breaking point when Mr. Krabs forces the Krusty Krab to stay open 24 hours a day. What starts as a competitive business decision turns into a psychological nightmare that nearly destroys SpongeBob's sanity and gives Plankton the perfect opportunity to steal the secret formula. The whole situation begins when Mr. Krabs notices that the Chum Bucket is advertising 23-hour service and immediately decides to one-up Plankton by keeping the Krusty Krab open 24 hours a day. While SpongeBob becomes ecstatic about never having to stop working, expressing his joy by punching through the wall and pinching himself repeatedly to make sure he's not dreaming, Squidward immediately recognizes this as a terrible decision. Unknown to everyone, this is exactly what Plankton wanted, as he reveals to Karen that his evil plan involves running SpongeBob into the ground until his mind cracks from exhaustion, allowing Plankton to extract the secret formula. The grueling schedule builds pressure day after day, with Mr. Krabs celebrating each milestone with his cowbell, while SpongeBob maintains his enthusiasm by singing the Krabby Patty song and even kissing the burgers he makes. By day 10, Squidward looks completely destroyed with bags under his eyes, so severe that even his bags have bags, causing a woman to scream when she sees him. Meanwhile, SpongeBob continues working with the same manic energy, showing no signs of the exhaustion that's clearly affecting everyone else in the restaurant. Plankton attempts to speed up the process by infiltrating the restaurant disguised as a spider, but Mr. Krabs squishes him before he can do any damage. Undeterred, Plankton calls in a massive order of 10 zero Krabby Patties under the fake name Peter Langton, hoping the enormous workload will finally push SpongeBob over the edge. SpongeBob responds to this challenge with even more enthusiasm, talking to his spatula about how they'll make all those patties together without any breaks. The montage of passing days shows the restaurant floating through time as SpongeBob counts his way through thousands of patties while Mr. Krabs continues announcing each new day milestone. By day 23, SpongeBob has made over 6 zero patties, and by day 35, he's approaching 9 0, but he still appears to be functioning normally. However, by day 43, when Mr. Krabs admits he's lost track of how many days they've been open, the cracks finally start to show as SpongeBob begins placing random objects like boots on serving trays instead of food. The complete mental breakdown arrives when SpongeBob's sleep deprivation causes severe hallucinations, making him see everyone around him as giant talking Krabby Patties. Mr. Krabs transforms into a burger that speaks gibberish. All the customers become patties with faces, and SpongeBob runs screaming through the restaurant convinced that killer Krabby Patties are trying to eat him. When Mr. Krabs tries to calm him down by showing him his spatula and grill, SpongeBob can repeat the words but completely loses control the moment he sees actual Krabby Patties. Mr. Krabs realizes there's something seriously wrong with SpongeBob's head and suggests he see a psychiatrist, which leads to Plankton's most elaborate scheme yet. Disguised as Dr. Peter Langton, complete with a fake beard and professional office setup in the Chum Bucket, Plankton attempts various psychological techniques to extract the formula from SpongeBob's damaged mind. He tries simple word association, but SpongeBob just repeats everything he says or makes tiny pronunciation changes. When Plankton gives him ingredient cards to arrange into a secret formula, SpongeBob instead builds them into a piano that promptly falls on the frustrated villain. As a last resort, Plankton turns to hypnosis, successfully putting SpongeBob into a deep sleep, but then struggling desperately to wake him up, despite using cymbals, trumpets, drums, and even a loud cell phone. During the hypnotic state, SpongeBob dreams about being chased and eaten by a giant Krabby Patty, but inside the burger's stomach, he discovers a friendly patty that brings him cookies and chocolate milk, helping him realize that Krabby Patties are actually his friends and belong in his heart, or more accurately, his arteries. SpongeBob wakes up completely cured, his phobia gone after simply getting the sleep his exhausted brain desperately needed. He rushes back to work with renewed energy, leaving Plankton screaming that therapy doesn't really work and that SpongeBob is still very sick. Back at the Krusty Krab, Mr. Krabs celebrates SpongeBob's recovery but immediately announces that instead of 24-hour shifts, they'll now work 23-hour shifts, showing that he learned absolutely nothing from nearly destroying his best employee's mental health. The episode demonstrates how workplace exploitation can push even the most dedicated employees past their breaking point, and how corporate greed often prioritizes profits over worker well-being. SpongeBob's temporary insanity serves as a dark reminder that everyone has limits, even those who seem unbreakably enthusiastic about their jobs. The fact that simple rest cured his condition highlights how basic human needs like sleep become casualties when businesses prioritize staying open over employee health. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. While workplace stress pushed SpongeBob to hallucinate about his job, his next mental break would come from something far more dangerous: lurking in forgotten food. Cuddle E-Hugs reveals how food poisoning can create terrifying hallucinations that seem completely real to the victim but invisible to everyone around them. What begins as SpongeBob refusing to waste a single Krabby Patty turns into a nightmare where his imaginary friend becomes a literal monster that devours his loved ones. The trouble starts during routine cleanup at the Krusty Krab, when Squidward discovers an extremely rotten and aged Krabby Patty that smells so foul he mistakes it for a sea urchin. When Squidward tries to throw it away, SpongeBob stops him with his usual philosophy that no Krabby Patty can ever truly be rotten. To prove his point, SpongeBob takes a bite of the moldy burger, immediately becomes sick, and burps up the rotten food, but his pride prevents him from admitting Squidward was right about throwing it out. SpongeBob runs behind the restaurant to deal with his nausea, and during this vulnerable moment, the food poisoning creates his first hallucination in the form of Cuddle E. Hugs, a giant fluffy hamster who claims to be SpongeBob's new best friend. The creature appears warm and friendly, offering tender hugs and affection that SpongeBob desperately craves. They spend the day playing together around Bikini Bottom, riding bicycles, playing patty cake, and enjoying what seems like an innocent friendship. The hallucination builds strength throughout their time together, with Cuddle E-Hugs becoming more solid and real in SpongeBob's mind. When they return home, the imaginary hamster even breaks SpongeBob's bed and offers his own fuzzy belly as a replacement mattress. Gary can see that SpongeBob is talking to empty air, but SpongeBob remains completely convinced that his new friend is real and present. The creature disappears overnight, leaving SpongeBob confused and missing the companionship. The next morning, SpongeBob eats more of the rotten patty while missing his friend, which triggers another wave of hallucinations and brings Cuddle E-Hugs back. The hamster explains his absence by claiming he's been practicing his tender head kisses, and encourages SpongeBob to share this affection with Gary, who reacts with disgust to SpongeBob's suddenly inappropriate behavior. SpongeBob decides to introduce his imaginary friend to his real friends, completely unaware that only he can see the creature. The social interactions become increasingly disturbing as SpongeBob tries to introduce Cuddle E-Hugs to Squidward, Patrick, and Sandy, all of whom react with confusion, concern, and frustration. Patrick becomes particularly upset when SpongeBob claims to have a new best friend, leading to Patrick fighting with empty air while SpongeBob watches in bewilderment. Sandy recognizes the situation as an imaginary friend scenario, but SpongeBob remains convinced that everyone else is just pretending not to see his companion. Cuddle E. Hugs manipulates SpongeBob's confusion by claiming that others can only see him if they eat the magic sandwich, referring to the rotten Krabby Patty as if it were something special rather than spoiled food. SpongeBob becomes excited about sharing this experience with his friends, completely unaware that he's about to poison everyone he cares about. He chops up the rotten patty into pieces, and the knife actually melts from the horrible stench, showing just how toxic the food has become. SpongeBob sets up a stand at the Krusty Krab offering free aged Krabby Patties to unsuspecting customers, successfully getting Patrick, Sandy, Mr. Krabs, and multiple other fish to eat the contaminated food. Just like SpongeBob, they all become violently ill and begin hallucinating the same creature, proving that the hallucination comes from the specific toxins in the rotten food rather than SpongeBob's imagination alone. Everyone becomes fascinated by Cuddle E. Hugs and rushes to hug the seemingly friendly creature. The nightmare reaches its peak when Cuddle E Hugs reveals his true nature, explaining that the E in his name stands for eat because he's always hungry. The friendly hamster transforms into a monster that begins devouring everyone who was poisoned by the rotten food, eating them one by one while cackling maniacally. SpongeBob watches in horror as his attempt to share friendship with others results in his imaginary companion, literally consuming his real friends, showing how his good intentions led to terrible consequences. The episode ends the next morning with everyone waking up sick and angry at SpongeBob for poisoning them, with Patrick directly blaming him for getting eaten by his imaginary friend. Sandy warns SpongeBob to imagine his friends more carefully, and everyone leaves in disgust, abandoning SpongeBob completely. When he eats more of the rotten patty to confront Cuddle E, Hugs about his behavior, the creature admits to being naturally predatory and hungry, showing no remorse for his actions. The final twist reveals that Cuddle E Hugs himself was also hallucinating, waking up in a little girl's bedroom surrounded by SpongeBob merchandise, suggesting that the creature was actually a real hamster that had eaten something toxic and dreamed the entire episode. This adds another layer to the story about how food poisoning can create shared delusions and false realities that seem completely convincing to those experiencing them. The episode serves as a dark warning about food safety and the dangers of consuming spoiled food, while also exploring themes of loneliness, the need for companionship, and how good intentions can lead to harmful consequences. SpongeBob's refusal to waste food and his desire to share experiences with friends ultimately results in mass food poisoning and social isolation, demonstrating how even positive traits can become destructive when taken to extremes. While SpongeBob's hallucinations from rotten food created imaginary threats, his next crisis would involve a real creature that he completely misidentified as a monster. Wormy demonstrates how fear and misunderstanding can transform an innocent natural process into a citywide panic that destroys an entire community. What begins as SpongeBob and Patrick pet-sitting for Sandy turns into mass hysteria when they witness a caterpillar's metamorphosis and mistake the resulting butterfly for a deadly monster. The situation starts when Sandy asks SpongeBob and Patrick to watch her pets while she goes out of town, giving them simple instructions to feed each animal appropriately. Among the various creatures in Sandy's tree dome is Wormy, a small caterpillar in a jar that Sandy mentions doesn't eat much before leaving. SpongeBob and Patrick immediately become fascinated with the little worm, taking him out to play hide-and-seek and other games throughout the day. They form such a strong bond with Wormy that SpongeBob creates a best friend ribbon for him, and both boys become emotional about having to say goodbye for the night. During the night, Wormy undergoes his natural metamorphosis from caterpillar to butterfly, a process shown through live-action footage of the actual transformation. The caterpillar creates a chrysalis and emerges as a completely different-looking creature, which sets up the confusion that will follow. When SpongeBob and Patrick return the next morning expecting to continue playing with their new friend, they find what appears to be a completely different creature in Wormy's jar, alongside his discarded ribbon and empty chrysalis. When SpongeBob opens the jar and the butterfly flies out, both boys get a close-up view that's shown as live-action footage of a buzzing horsefly, creating a terrifying visual that sends them running for cover. They immediately conclude that this flying creature must have eaten their friend Wormy, since they have no understanding of metamorphosis and can't conceive that the butterfly and caterpillar are the same animal. Patrick becomes particularly distraught, asking why these things keep happening to him, while SpongeBob takes charge of the situation by planning their escape. Their attempts to capture or escape from Wormy become increasingly desperate and ridiculous as they try various schemes that all backfire spectacularly. They attempt to trap him with a jar and telephone, use Patrick as bait with an apple in his mouth, and try to catch him with a net that Patrick tears right through while running away in terror. Finally, SpongeBob succeeds in trapping Wormy inside a soap bubble, which allows the butterfly to fly out of the tree dome while still being contained, giving the boys a false sense of victory. The crisis escalates dramatically when they realize Wormy is heading toward the Krusty Krab, prompting them to rush over and warn Mr. Krabs and Squidward about the approaching danger. They burst into the restaurant just as Mr. Krabs and Squidward are taking photographs, tackling them to the ground while shouting warnings about the monster. When they explain that the creature wants to eat everyone just like it ate Wormy, Squidward dismisses their concerns as typical foolishness and walks over to investigate the butterfly himself. Both Squidward and Mr. Krabs initially laugh at the harmless-looking butterfly, with Mr. Krabs commenting that it looks cute and reminds him of money. However, the moment they see the close-up live-action footage of the buzzing insect, they both scream in terror and run away so fast that they leave their clothing behind. SpongeBob and Patrick find only underwear and Mr. Krabs' hat, leading them to believe that the monster has now consumed their co-workers as well, bringing the total victims to 3 of their closest friends. Convinced that Bikini Bottom faces an existential threat, SpongeBob and Patrick take it upon themselves to warn the entire city about the flying monster. Despite SpongeBob's initial intention to handle the situation with great care and sensitivity, they immediately resort to running through the streets screaming about a monster on the loose. Their panic spreads rapidly through the population, causing mass hysteria as citizens flee in terror from what they now believe is a deadly creature capable of eating people whole. The citywide panic reaches catastrophic proportions as SpongeBob and Patrick continue their warning campaign with balloons, megaphones, and posted signs showing Wormy's image with "Beware" written underneath. The mass evacuation becomes so chaotic that infrastructure collapses, buildings catch fire, and the entire city is reduced to smoking ruins. A news report featuring live-action footage of a monarch butterfly confirms the giant monster attack to television viewers, further cementing the false narrative about Wormy's dangerous nature. The chase sequence that follows shows the absurd extent of the panic as SpongeBob, Patrick, and the entire population of Bikini Bottom flee from a single harmless butterfly. Wormy even stops at traffic lights like a law-abiding citizen, highlighting the ridiculous nature of everyone's fear. The pursuit continues through burning buildings and destroyed streets until the entire welcome sign for Bikini Bottom snaps in half, symbolizing the complete destruction of their community. Sandy returns from her trip to find her hometown reduced to smoking rubble, initially assuming a tornado hit the area. When she sees Wormy flying around, she calmly recognizes that he transformed earlier than expected and simply puts him back in his jar, immediately ending the crisis that destroyed their entire city. The citizens emerge from hiding and cheer Sandy as a hero for catching the monster, while Sandy remains completely oblivious to the fact that her brief absence and one small caterpillar caused the total annihilation of Bikini Bottom. The episode serves as a cautionary tale about how ignorance and panic can transform harmless situations into destructive disasters. SpongeBob and Patrick's lack of basic knowledge about nature, combined with their tendency to jump to the worst possible conclusions, created a community-wide catastrophe that could have been avoided with simple education about butterfly metamorphosis. The story also highlights how mass hysteria can spread faster than facts, leading entire populations to make irrational decisions based on fear rather than evidence. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. While SpongeBob's misunderstanding of natural processes caused citywide destruction, his next encounter with fear would involve something truly supernatural that required genuine courage to overcome. Scaredy Pants explores how trying to avoid fear completely can lead to dangerous situations where real bravery becomes necessary to protect the people you care about. What starts as SpongeBob's attempt to overcome his Halloween phobia using a simple mental trick turns into a supernatural crisis that threatens his friends' very souls. The episode begins on Halloween night with SpongeBob decorating his house in an overly cute and sparkly manner, complete with glitter and cheerful banners that spell out "Hallow" instead of anything scary. When Patrick arrives in his night costume and criticizes the decorations for being too cute, SpongeBob explains his philosophy that Halloween should be about sharing candy, holding hands, and singing songs rather than frightening experiences. His flower costume reinforces this innocent approach to what's traditionally a spooky holiday, showing how completely he misunderstands the purpose of Halloween. Patrick takes SpongeBob to see Squidward's house, where the grumpy neighbor is terrorizing trick-or-treaters by offering onions instead of candy and making ghostly sounds. When SpongeBob hides inside Patrick's costume out of fear, he admits his shameful secret that while he loves trick-or-treating, he's too afraid to go out on Halloween. Patrick responds with his philosophy that scary equals funny, suggesting that SpongeBob can overcome his fear by reframing frightening experiences as humorous ones. SpongeBob tentatively accepts this advice but immediately gets scared by a simple ghost balloon, showing how deeply rooted his phobia really is. They visit Sandy's tree dome, which has been transformed into a mad scientist laboratory, where she performs classic Halloween tricks like having them guess what's in mystery jars. SpongeBob successfully applies Patrick's philosophy when he feels noodles and thinks they're worm guts, then laughs when Sandy reveals the truth. However, the second jar contains Patrick's actual brain, which SpongeBob continues poking while Patrick makes disturbing faces, creating a genuinely unsettling moment that Sandy finds gross. The scene culminates with Sandy's mechanical acorn monster puppet that chases and eats SpongeBob and Patrick, giving them a thrilling but ultimately harmless scare that reinforces the scary equals funny concept. The philosophy gets tested further at the Krusty Krab's haunted attraction, where Mr. Krabs has created displays showing the horrors of the Chum Bucket, featuring Plankton doing supposedly scary things. When SpongeBob and Patrick laugh instead of screaming, Mr. Krabs becomes frustrated that modern kids don't understand proper Halloween terror like he experienced as a child. This sets up the contrast between SpongeBob's new fearless attitude and the expectation that Halloween should genuinely frighten people, foreshadowing the conflict to come. At Plankton's competing attraction, the tiny villain tries to terrify visitors with displays claiming that Krabby Patties are made from people, complete with scary imagery of Mr. Krabs and SpongeBob as monsters who grind victims into burgers. While Patrick shows genuine fear during these presentations, SpongeBob continues laughing and treating everything as entertainment, demonstrating how completely he's adopted the scary equals funny mindset. His laughter starts echoing throughout Bikini Bottom, creating the disturbance that attracts supernatural attention. The Flying Dutchman, the legendary ghost pirate who considers Halloween his personal holiday, becomes enraged when he hears SpongeBob's laughter, disrupting the traditional atmosphere of fear and terror. After demonstrating his power by properly scaring an unafraid trick-or-treater, the Flying Dutchman confronts SpongeBob directly, and becomes incredulous when the sponge continues laughing at his most frightening displays. SpongeBob even uses the ghost's fiery breath to roast marshmallows, showing how completely he's lost his natural fear response. Realizing that SpongeBob's fearlessness stems from poor quality Halloween decorations around town, the Flying Dutchman decides to provide a proper frightening experience aboard his ghost ship. He transforms SpongeBob and Patrick's wagon into a roller cart and takes them on an elaborate haunted ride, complete with ghostly pirates, singing skeletons, three-headed horses, and various supernatural horrors. Throughout this genuinely terrifying experience, SpongeBob continues laughing while Patrick remains appropriately scared, showing the stark difference in their reactions. When his best supernatural efforts fail to frighten SpongeBob, the Flying Dutchman resorts to targeting what people usually fear most, losing their loved ones. He uses his ghostly powers to steal the souls of Sandy, Mr. Krabs, Squidward, Plankton, and Gary, trapping them in cages aboard his ship while leaving their bodies motionless in Bikini Bottom. When he also takes Patrick's soul, SpongeBob finally realizes that some situations are genuinely serious and not funny at all, causing him to update his mental equation from scary equals funny to scary equals hosh. SpongeBob's terror becomes so intense that his skeleton literally separates from his skin, and they both run away from the ship together. However, his loyalty to his friends overrides his fear, and after a brief conversation between his skeleton and skin about showing backbone and saving their friends, he reassembles himself and returns to confront the Flying Dutchman. This moment represents his transition from avoiding fear to accepting it as necessary for protecting others. The final confrontation involves SpongeBob attempting to scare the Flying Dutchman using Sandy's acorn puppet, which fails because ghosts can't be touched by physical objects. When the Flying Dutchman mocks SpongeBob's attempt and claims he couldn't be frightened in a million eternities, Plankton suggests that the ghost look inside SpongeBob's brain, having experienced its terrors firsthand. The Flying Dutchman accepts this challenge and shrinks himself to enter SpongeBob's mind, where he encounters a psychedelic nightmare of pure innocence featuring unicorns, rainbows, talking hearts, jelly beans, and overwhelming cuteness. The experience inside SpongeBob's brain proves so traumatically wholesome that the Flying Dutchman becomes genuinely terrified, especially when SpongeBob mentions his most embarrassing fear, naked baby pictures of himself. This summons a giant baby version of SpongeBob that hugs and kisses the ghost pirate while surrounded by all the other innocent dream characters, creating such an overload of pure goodness that the Flying Dutchman screams in horror and abandons his ship entirely. With the Flying Dutchman's defeat, all the stolen souls return to their bodies, and SpongeBob's friends celebrate his heroic victory. The experience teaches SpongeBob a more nuanced lesson about fear that he struggles to articulate, eventually settling on not being afraid to never be scared of being afraid again. This confusing statement reflects how the experience has complicated his understanding of when fear is appropriate versus when courage is needed. The episode demonstrates that while fear can often be overcome through perspective changes and humor, some situations genuinely require courage and action rather than just reframing. SpongeBob's journey from complete fearfulness to fearless laughter to appropriate courage shows a mature understanding that bravery means feeling fear, but acting anyway, when protecting others matters more than personal comfort. His innocent mind ultimately proves more powerful than supernatural evil, suggesting that pure goodness can triumph over malevolent forces through its very incomprehensibility to those who embrace darkness. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. While SpongeBob's journey with supernatural forces taught him about appropriate courage, his next challenge would involve dealing with the destructive power of jealousy and imitation in friendship. Big Pink Loser reveals how envy can poison even the closest relationships when one friend's success makes the other feel inadequate and worthless. What begins as Patrick's innocent excitement about receiving his first award turns into an obsessive copying spree that nearly destroys his friendship with SpongeBob and his own sense of identity. The trouble starts when Patrick wakes up to find a delivery person dropping a shiny gold trophy in his mouth while he's yawning. Overwhelmed with excitement about receiving his first award ever, Patrick immediately wants to share the news with everyone around him, from his rock to nearby jellyfish to an island above the surface. When he rushes to show SpongeBob, who's carefully building a house of cards shaped like Gary, Patrick's enthusiastic entrance destroys the delicate structure and sends Gary flying away, immediately setting up the contrast between his chaotic energy and SpongeBob's focused achievements. SpongeBob reads the trophy and discovers it's actually addressed to him for outstanding achievement in achievement, which confuses Patrick since he thinks it's a funny way to spell his name. When SpongeBob gently explains that the award belongs to him, Patrick's joy turns to disappointment, especially when he sees SpongeBob's massive closet overflowing with trophies and ribbons that come pouring out onto the floor. The sight of SpongeBob's countless achievements makes Patrick break down crying as he realizes he's never accomplished anything worthy of recognition. SpongeBob tries to encourage Patrick by pointing out that his name is Star, and he can do anything he wants, but Patrick's self-doubt has already taken hold. His initial grand ambitions to defeat giant monkey men and save dimensions quickly scale down through SpongeBob's guidance until they settle on the smallest possible goal, getting a job at the Krusty Krab. SpongeBob enthusiastically supports this plan, sharing that he does award-worthy things at work all the time, which gives Patrick hope that employment might finally earn him recognition. Mr. Krabs agrees to hire Patrick at the generous wage of $50 an hour, which SpongeBob mentions is much better than his own starting situation where he had to pay Mr. Krabs $100 per hour to work there. Squidward immediately quits upon learning about Patrick's hiring, placing his employee hat on Patrick's head and walking out, leaving Patrick to begin his new career with SpongeBob's guidance and support. Patrick's work performance proves catastrophically bad from the very beginning, as he completely misunderstands every basic task despite SpongeBob's patient instruction. When asked to deliver food to customers, Patrick eats the orders before they reach the tables, then spits chewed food in customers' faces when SpongeBob asks him to try again. His attempt at answering phones becomes a running gag where he repeatedly tells callers, "No, this is Patrick," when they ask if they've reached the Krusty Krab, not understanding that he should identify the restaurant rather than himself. The sweeping task reveals Patrick's fundamental inability to use tools correctly, as he sweeps with the handle end of the broom instead of the brush, prompting a customer to ask if he just blew in from Stupid Town. Patrick's frustration builds as more awards arrive for SpongeBob, causing him to sweep harder and eventually jump around banging the broom head on the floor, filling the restaurant with dust that makes customers cough. Each failure deepens his sense of inadequacy and makes him more desperate for success. SpongeBob's final attempt to help Patrick succeed involves the seemingly simple task of opening a jar, which becomes an extended sequence of Patrick struggling with basic concepts and motor skills. Patrick confuses pickles for jars, spatulas for jars, and even tries to use SpongeBob himself as a jar before finally grasping the correct object. The process of removing the lid requires SpongeBob to guide Patrick's hand inch by inch using hot and cold directions until Patrick finally succeeds, though he immediately thinks he broke the jar by opening it correctly. The jar opening success gives Patrick renewed confidence and leads him to adopt a new strategy, copying everything SpongeBob does exactly. Patrick arrives at work the next day dressed identically to SpongeBob and begins mimicking his every action, word, and gesture. Initially, SpongeBob finds this flattering but creepy, but the copying quickly becomes annoying as Patrick shadows his every move, causes accidents by following too closely, and even repeats SpongeBob's thoughts when they both think about being safe inside their minds. The copying escalates into a competition when SpongeBob tries to demonstrate his superiority through increasingly dangerous stunts, starting with jump rope tricks that leave both characters broken into pieces, then hammer-hitting contests that result in Patrick getting dizzy and seeing trophy-shaped birds flying around his head. Patrick even paints his rock to look like SpongeBob's pineapple house, prompting SpongeBob to reciprocate by dressing as Patrick and mocking his lazy, unsuccessful lifestyle. SpongeBob's cruel imitation reveals his frustration and growing resentment toward Patrick's copying, as he sarcastically calls Patrick a big, pink loser, while Patrick insists that copying SpongeBob has brought him closer to earning an award than anything else he's ever done. Their friendship reaches its breaking point as Patrick refuses to acknowledge his own identity, claiming that Patrick's not here and fully committing to his SpongeBob persona. The resolution arrives through another delivery truck, which brings Patrick a trophy for doing absolutely nothing longer than anyone else. This award recognizes Patrick's natural talent for inactivity and laziness, the very qualities that SpongeBob had mocked, but which represent Patrick's authentic self. The recognition of his genuine abilities, rather than his attempts to copy someone else's success, immediately restores Patrick's happiness and self-confidence. Patrick's joy at receiving an award for being himself, rather than imitating SpongeBob, allows both friends to return to their normal outfits and relationship dynamic. He declares his intention to protect his title by going back to his rock and falling asleep, fully embracing the lazy lifestyle that earned him recognition. The episode ends with Patrick returning to his authentic self, and SpongeBob accepting that his friend has his own unique talents worth celebrating. The story serves as a commentary on how comparison and envy can destroy self-esteem and authentic relationships, while also showing that everyone has different talents that deserve recognition. Patrick's journey from inadequacy through imitation to self-acceptance demonstrates that trying to be someone else will never bring genuine satisfaction, and that recognition for one's authentic qualities, even seemingly negative ones like laziness, can be more fulfilling than copied success. While Patrick's journey taught him to value his authentic self over imitation, SpongeBob's next crisis would involve taking safety precautions to such an extreme that he becomes completely paralyzed by fear. I Had an Accident demonstrates how traumatic experiences can create irrational phobias that destroy quality of life when taken to unhealthy extremes. What begins as SpongeBob suffering a serious sandboarding injury turns into complete agoraphobia that isolates him from friends, activities, and the outside world entirely. The situation starts during a fun sandboarding trip to Sand Mountain where SpongeBob, Patrick, and Sandy are enjoying various tricks and stunts. SpongeBob shows off by performing moves named after Squidward, imitating his grumpy personality while sliding down the mountain, but his attention to comedy rather than safety causes him to hit a log and fly off the mountain completely. When Sandy shouts for him to land on his bottom to cushion the fall, SpongeBob misunderstands and removes his pants, leading to his posterior breaking into tiny pieces when he crashes. The medical treatment reveals the severity of SpongeBob's injury, as a doctor explains that his gluteus maximus required 20 hours of reconstruction using both staples and glue sticks to put all the pieces back together. The doctor warns SpongeBob that he was extremely lucky to recover, and that one more similar injury could result in him needing an iron butt, a mechanical device worn by another patient who complains about the constant itching. This medical warning plants the seed of fear that will grow into SpongeBob's complete withdrawal from normal life. SpongeBob's paranoia begins immediately after leaving the hospital, as he starts protecting his rear end from any possible contact or impact. He warns random pedestrians to stay away from his backside, refuses to join football games when he sees players slapping each other's bottoms, and runs away screaming when Jimmy invites him to participate in a 7-mile spanking machine where people crawl between legs getting spanked. Every normal social interaction becomes a potential threat to his vulnerable posterior. The fear escalates dramatically when SpongeBob decides that no part of his body is safe outside his house, leading him to become completely housebound. When Sandy and Patrick return from more sandboarding adventures, they find SpongeBob sitting in a fetal position on his floor, surrounded by 3 inanimate objects he's named as friends: Penny the coin, Chip the potato chip, and Used napkin. He declares his intention to live out the remainder of his life indoors, claiming that the accident made him realize how dangerous the outside world really is. SpongeBob's isolation becomes increasingly elaborate as he develops systems to maintain his hermit lifestyle without ever leaving his house. He uses an extremely long spatula to flip patties at the Krusty Krab from his living room, plans to filter feed instead of eating regular food, and insists that his inanimate friends provide all the companionship he needs. When Sandy points out the loneliness and impracticality of this lifestyle, SpongeBob remains adamant that he will never leave his house again, leading to an extended argument with Patrick about the meaning of never. Sandy and Patrick attempt various strategies to lure SpongeBob outside, including jellyfishing demonstrations, birthday cake singing, trampoline jumping, ice cream offerings, underwater surfing, Ferris wheel rides, and clam wrestling. SpongeBob watches these activities through his window while engaging in what he considers a much safer hobby: dust collecting with tiny nets and magnifying glasses. He even sings a song about the joys of staying indoors, featuring Penny in a solo that consists of complete silence. The final rescue attempt involves Sandy and Patrick staging a fake gorilla attack, with Patrick wearing the same gorilla costume he used for Halloween. SpongeBob immediately recognizes the deception and refuses to come outside even to save his friends, pointing out that even Chip knows it's Patrick in his old costume. However, the situation becomes genuinely dangerous when a real gorilla appears, still wearing a Patrick suit that it removes to reveal its true nature. The real gorilla proceeds to capture Sandy and Patrick in a bag and beats them repeatedly with various objects while SpongeBob watches in horror from his window. Despite his terror of going outside, SpongeBob realizes that his friends would risk anything to save him and that he must do the same for them. After saying goodbye to Gary and his inanimate friends, SpongeBob forces himself to open his door and take his first steps outside since the accident. SpongeBob's brief moment of triumph at successfully going outside gets interrupted when a piece of paper blown by the wind touches his face, causing him to panic and scream for help from Chip. However, he recovers from this minor scare and celebrates his achievement of making it outside without serious injury. Unfortunately, the gorilla immediately grabs him and tears him in half, proving that his fears about outdoor dangers were somewhat justified. Even while split into 2 halves, SpongeBob apologizes to his friends for causing the situation and admits that while he's no longer afraid of going outside, he's now terrified of gorillas instead. The absurd resolution comes when SpongeBob points out the logical impossibility of a gorilla existing underwater, causing the creature to panic and flee on a zebra named George. The episode breaks the 4th wall by showing a live-action family watching the story on television and turning it off in confusion. The story serves as both a commentary on how trauma can create irrational fears and an examination of when safety precautions become more harmful than helpful. SpongeBob's complete withdrawal from life represents an extreme response to injury that causes more problems than it solves, isolating him from friends and meaningful activities. However, the episode also validates some level of caution, as SpongeBob does get seriously injured again when he finally goes outside, suggesting that finding balance between reasonable safety and paralyzing fear remains challenging. The absurd ending with the live-action gorilla and zebra reinforces the episode's theme that some fears are based on genuinely impossible scenarios, while others stem from real but manageable risks that shouldn't prevent normal living. SpongeBob's journey from reckless fun through traumatic injury to complete isolation, and finally back to accepting calculated risks, reflects the complex relationship between safety, fear, and quality of life. While SpongeBob's extreme safety measures isolated him from the outside world, Squidward's next ordeal would involve being trapped by his own attempts to avoid social interaction, leading to an accidental journey through time itself. SB-129 explores how the desperate desire to escape from annoying social situations can lead to far worse consequences than simply enduring the original problem. What begins as Squidward's simple attempt to practice clarinet without SpongeBob's interruptions turns into a terrifying odyssey through different time periods that ultimately makes him appreciate what he was trying to escape. The episode starts on a peaceful Sunday morning when Squidward prepares to practice his clarinet, only to have SpongeBob's alarm clock startle him so badly that the instrument gets lodged in his throat. SpongeBob immediately invites Squidward to go jellyfishing, but Squidward firmly refuses and slams his door. This sets up a repetitive cycle where SpongeBob and Patrick keep knocking and asking if Squidward is ready to join them, with Squidward repeatedly answering no and slamming the door each time. The persistent interruptions drive Squidward to declare that he'll never be ready and doesn't want to participate in their activities, but SpongeBob and Patrick claim to understand while continuing their bothersome behavior. When Squidward realizes he's accidentally locked himself out of his own house by shutting the door too forcefully, SpongeBob opens it and asks if he's ready again, pushing Squidward's frustration to the breaking point. He throws them out of his house and desperately looks for somewhere he can practice in peace. Squidward gets the idea to hide at the Krusty Krab since it's closed on Sundays, thinking he can finally practice his clarinet without interruption. However, SpongeBob and Patrick follow him there and search throughout the restaurant calling his name. Squidward hides in the walk-in freezer, and when his friends leave after deciding he must already be at Jellyfish Fields, he celebrates his successful escape. Unfortunately, the freezer door has locked from the inside, trapping him completely. Initially confident that someone will notice his absence and rescue him quickly, Squidward settles in to wait. However, the narrator reveals that 20 years pass, showing Squidward frozen solid inside the deteriorating freezer until the hinges rust away and the door falls down. A robotic descendant of SpongeBob called Spongetron discovers the frozen cephalopod and uses a laser hammer to melt the ice, though the beam accidentally hits Squidward's buttocks and causes him to scream. Spongetron welcomes Squidward to the future, explaining that everything is chrome in this time period, which Squidward initially refuses to believe until he sees a worker spray painting a flower with chrome paint. Spongetron introduces his clones X, Y, and Z, mentioning that all 486 letters of the future alphabet are represented, and reveals that the date is March 6, 4017, meaning Squidward was frozen for exactly 20 years. When a two-headed Patrick descendant called Patron appears and suggests jellyfishing, Squidward desperately asks for help getting back to his own time. Spongetron directs Squidward to a time machine down the hall, but Squidward accidentally enters the can opener first and gets shredded into spring-shaped pieces before finding the correct door. The time machine has settings for past and future, and Squidward decides that if SpongeBob exists in the future, he should try the past instead. He sets the machine to the past and travels back to prehistoric Bikini Bottom, where he encounters primitive sea creatures and thinks he's finally found a place without SpongeBob. However, Squidward soon discovers primitive versions of SpongeBob and Patrick who are fascinated by him and don't understand basic concepts like jellyfishing. When they try to handle jellyfish directly instead of using nets, Squidward becomes frustrated and teaches them how to make nets from their loincloths and catch jellyfish properly. His attempt to finally play clarinet in peace gets interrupted when the primitive duo goes berserk at the sound of his music and chases him back to the time machine. In his panic to escape, Squidward frantically operates the time machine controls and accidentally breaks the lever, causing the machine to malfunction and transport him to a strange dimension called Nowhere. This blank, a white space, contains nothing but floating tiles and echoing voices that repeat the word alone endlessly, giving Squidward exactly what he thought he wanted, but in the most terrifying way possible. The isolation becomes so overwhelming that he runs around frantically trying to escape while the voices continue chanting. The psychological torture of complete solitude breaks Squidward's spirit, and he falls through the floor back into the broken time machine, sobbing and declaring that he wants to go home. He expresses how much he misses Bikini Bottom, his Easter Island head house, and most surprisingly, even SpongeBob. The moment he mentions SpongeBob's name, the time machine responds to his genuine emotion and transports him back to present-day Bikini Bottom, where SpongeBob and Patrick are still waiting for him. Squidward's relief at returning home is overwhelming as he tries to explain his incredible journey through space, time, and nothingness, though SpongeBob and Patrick simply greet him normally without understanding what he's been through. When they ask if his return means he wants to go jellyfishing, Squidward immediately refuses and asks who invented such an annoying game. SpongeBob and Patrick reveal that Squidward himself created jellyfishing, having taught it to the primitive versions during his time travel adventure. The revelation that Squidward is responsible for creating the very activity he finds so annoying creates a perfect time loop paradox. His attempt to escape SpongeBob's jellyfishing invitations led him to accidentally invent jellyfishing in the past, making himself the source of his own frustration. Faced with this cosmic irony and the realization that his efforts to avoid his problems only made them worse, Squidward declares his intention to go back, presumably to accept the consequences of his actions. The episode serves as a meditation on how trying to escape from minor annoyances can lead to far greater suffering, and how isolation, even when desired, can become its own form of torture. Squidward's journey shows that the things we find annoying about our daily lives often seem precious when we're truly alone, and that community and connection, even when imperfect, are preferable to complete solitude. The time loop structure reinforces the futility of trying to escape from problems that are ultimately of our own making. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. While Squidward's time travel misadventure taught him to appreciate what he had, his next encounter with SpongeBob would involve an invasion of privacy so complete that it destroys his sense of personal identity and sanctuary. Can You Spare a Dime? Reveals how desperate loneliness can drive someone to violate boundaries in increasingly disturbing ways, ultimately trapping both the victim and perpetrator in an unhealthy cycle. What begins as SpongeBob's innocent desire to have Squidward visit his home escalates into identity theft, stalking behavior, and the complete destruction of Squidward's personal space and belongings. The episode opens with Squidward peacefully reading an art book at work when Mr. Krabs asks about his after-work plans, receiving only a disinterested nope in response. SpongeBob approaches with the same question, speaking in an unusually relaxed tone and inviting Squidward to drop by his house if he's in the neighborhood. Squidward responds with sarcasm and shows no interest in socializing, prompting him to simply disappear from the restaurant rather than continue the conversation. SpongeBob follows Squidward home and extends a more formal invitation to visit, but Squidward firmly rejects the offer, declaring that he will never visit SpongeBob's house ever. His emphatic refusal literally blows SpongeBob away, but instead of accepting this clear boundary, SpongeBob begins crying and begging Squidward to come over, claiming it's been so long since his last visit. When Squidward points out that he's never visited before, SpongeBob continues his tearful pleading while following Squidward to various locations around town. The persistent harassment continues as SpongeBob clings to Squidward's leg, while sobbing and repeating his requests at the bus stop, laundromat, bargain mart, restaurants, and finally at Squidward's own front door. Squidward physically removes SpongeBob from his leg, steps on him, and slams his door. But SpongeBob cheerfully accepts this rejection and suggests they try again some other time. 24 hours later, the cycle begins again when SpongeBob approaches Squidward at work with the same invitation. Squidward preemptively shuts down the conversation by asking why he would leave the comfort of his home for SpongeBob's dirty little hovel, but SpongeBob's innocent suggestion about adding throw pillows reveals that he's completely missing the point of Squidward's rejection. Later, while doing puzzles with Patrick, SpongeBob explains his frustration about Squidward's refusal to visit, and Patrick suggests borrowing something so that Squidward will have to come over to retrieve it. This advice leads SpongeBob to steal Squidward's vacuum cleaner. SpongeBob's theft creates the excuse he needs to force Squidward into his house, but the violation goes far beyond simple borrowing. When Squidward calls to demand his vacuum back, SpongeBob excitedly treats it as a social call from his favorite next-door neighbor, completely ignoring Squidward's anger about the theft. SpongeBob claims he's been doing home improvements that will make his house unrecognizable, setting up the horrifying revelation that awaits Squidward. When Squidward arrives to collect his property, he discovers that SpongeBob has created an exact replica of his living room, complete with every piece of furniture, decoration, and personal item. SpongeBob explains that since Squidward wouldn't leave the comfort of his home, he brought that comfort to his house instead. The level of detail in the replication immediately unsettles Squidward, who recognizes his coffee table, vase, snack bowl, coasters, and even his personal art books copied perfectly. The invasion of privacy becomes increasingly disturbing as Squidward explores the replica and finds his hallway reproduced down to a specific chip in the paint from when he moved in. His bathroom contains the exact contents of his medicine cabinet, including personal items like rash cream that SpongeBob should have no knowledge of. When SpongeBob appears unexpectedly and causes Squidward to slip on spilled rash cream, the accident demonstrates how this violation of boundaries creates physical danger as well as psychological trauma. Squidward's discovery of a room containing all 492 of his self-portraits, copied and improved upon, represents the complete theft of his artistic identity and personal expression. The sight of his most private creations displayed in someone else's home while being executed better than his originals breaks down Squidward's sense of self-worth and uniqueness. He tries to rationalize the situation by calling it mere mimicry without understanding of style or sophistication, but the evidence clearly contradicts this comforting lie. The search for his vacuum cleaner leads Squidward to a closet where SpongeBob has hidden his stolen property alongside his own belongings, creating a symbolic representation of how SpongeBob has invaded and mixed his identity with Squidward's. When Squidward finally retrieves the vacuum, the appliance has become lodged inside his body, suggesting how deeply this violation has penetrated his sense of self. He treats the vacuum like a rescued companion and declares their intention to leave this horror show with dignity. The climax reveals the ultimate consequence of SpongeBob's obsessive behavior when Squidward discovers that his house has burned down because he left a casserole in the oven while being detained at SpongeBob's replica. The fireman's description of some knucklehead leaving food cooking shows how SpongeBob's manipulation has caused real property damage through forced distraction. With nowhere else to go, Squidward faces the nightmare of being trapped indefinitely in the replica of his own home. The psychological breaking point comes when SpongeBob cheerfully offers to let Squidward stay at his house until the repairs are completed, creating a prison disguised as hospitality. Squidward's brief fantasy of having tea with his vacuum cleaner while eating burnt casserole reveals how the trauma has damaged his grip on reality. He faints from the overwhelming stress of realizing he's completely trapped in someone else's obsessive recreation of his life. The episode ends with bitter irony as SpongeBob sleeps contentedly in Squidward's burnt house, finally having achieved his goal of spending time together, while Squidward lies trapped in the replica bedroom. SpongeBob's satisfaction at having Squidward over for a visit shows his complete inability to understand the violation and trauma he's caused. Gary's unimpressed meow serves as the only voice of reason in a situation where obsessive behavior has been rewarded with success. The story serves as a disturbing exploration of how loneliness can drive people to violate boundaries, steal identities, and manipulate situations to force unwanted intimacy. SpongeBob's actions progress from persistent invitation to theft to stalking to identity theft to false imprisonment, showing how obsessive behavior escalates when boundaries are ignored. Squidward's ordeal demonstrates how victims of such behavior can become trapped not just physically but psychologically, losing their sense of self and safety in the process. While Squidward's previous ordeal with SpongeBob's replica house violated his privacy and personal space, his next crisis would involve literally losing his identity and being treated like a wild animal by the very people trying to help him. The Thing demonstrates how attempts to escape from minor annoyances can lead to complete dehumanization and loss of agency when circumstances spiral beyond anyone's control. What begins as Squidward seeking a quiet evening away from SpongeBob and Patrick's interruptions turns into a nightmare where he becomes trapped in concrete and mistaken for an unknown species requiring capture and confinement. The episode opens with Squidward cautiously checking that SpongeBob isn't around before settling in for a peaceful evening of public television featuring smooth jazz performed by Kelpie G. However, SpongeBob and Patrick are playing loudly outside, with SpongeBob squirting sand through his head like Play-Doh hair while Patrick encourages him to repeat the performance. When Squidward complains about the noise disrupting his viewing, the duo moves their entertainment directly into his house without invitation. SpongeBob and Patrick make themselves comfortable on Squidward's couch and begin asking constant questions about the television program, requesting volume adjustments, and inquiring about plot details and character motivations. Their relentless interruptions, punctuated by repeatedly calling Squidward's name, drive him to a breaking point where he screams and abandons his own home just to escape their presence. He declares his intention to go somewhere far away where they can't bother him while watching his television. Squidward's frustrated exit leads to immediate disaster when he crashes his bicycle into a cement truck and gets buried under a load of wet concrete. The impact launches him through coral fields, a sewer pipe, and into a swarm of jellyfish that sting him before he lands in jellyfish fields. The concrete hardens around his body, creating a shell that obscures his identity and makes movement extremely difficult. He spends 5 days trapped and wandering, hungry, tired, and lost, with his only consolation being the absence of SpongeBob. The irony becomes apparent when SpongeBob and Patrick encounter Squidward while jellyfishing but fail to recognize him due to the concrete casing. SpongeBob approaches the strange creature with curiosity rather than fear, though the smell emanating from the trapped Squidward causes tears to flood his eyes. When Squidward attempts to communicate through muffled growls, SpongeBob initially thinks he might be dangerous, but quickly reframes him as an endangered species in need of protection and care. Patrick's attempt to help involves telling the creature to go away because nobody wants endangered species around, demonstrating his fundamental misunderstanding of both conservation and basic kindness. SpongeBob corrects this approach and suggests they care for the creature with love and affection, deciding to adopt him as a pet named Smelly. This decision strips Squidward of his identity entirely, reducing him to a nameless animal whose own preferences and needs become irrelevant. SpongeBob's well-intentioned care proves inadequate and inappropriate for Squidward's actual needs, as he provides a bed made of newspapers, kibble for food, and treats him like a household pet, rather than recognizing his obvious intelligence and distress. When Gary attacks the newcomer with unusual aggression, SpongeBob notes that Gary has never behaved this way except around Squidward, creating dramatic irony as the audience recognizes the connection, while the characters remain oblivious. Unable to house both Gary and Smelly due to their conflict, SpongeBob passes the responsibility to Patrick, who proves even less capable of proper care. Patrick's idea of pet ownership involves repeatedly throwing balls at the immobilized creature, causing increasing anger and frustration that culminates in retaliation. When Squidward finally fights back by throwing the ball at Patrick, the starfish panics and calls animal control, reporting a dangerous wild animal in his home. The arrival of authorities transforms Squidward's situation from pet ownership to imprisonment, as police surround him with helicopters and squad cars, treating him as a legitimate threat to public safety. SpongeBob's attempts to protect Smelly by explaining that he's just a poor, dumb wild animal actually reinforce the dehumanization by confirming that he's not considered a person deserving of rights or consideration. The authorities' declaration that wild animals belong in zoos rather than residential areas leads to Squidward's capture and incarceration. The zoo placement represents the ultimate loss of freedom and dignity, as Squidward finds himself caged and labeled as species unknown, while visitors mock his appearance and call him hideous. The public ridicule and confinement behind bars strip away any remaining vestiges of his former life and identity, reducing him to a spectacle for entertainment. SpongeBob and Patrick's observation that no one should be treated so poorly, even someone as ugly as Smelly, shows their growing awareness that the situation has become cruel and unjust. Their rescue mission involves breaking into the zoo at night, but Patrick's incompetence nearly sabotages the operation when he gets tangled in ropes and makes excessive noise that alerts security. The escape through the sewers provides temporary freedom, but leads them deeper underground until they emerge in what appears to be a primitive jungle environment inhabited by creatures that resemble Squidward in his concrete shell. SpongeBob and Patrick's decision to abandon Smelly with what they assume is his real family demonstrates how their good intentions ultimately serve their own emotional needs rather than the creature's actual welfare. They push the reluctant Squidward toward the group of similar-looking beings while expressing sadness about losing their adopted pet, framing the abandonment as a noble sacrifice for his benefit. Their departure leaves Squidward trapped among strangers in an unknown location. The resolution comes when the mysterious creatures reveal themselves to be an audience for Kelpie G's smooth jazz performances, the same music Squidward was trying to enjoy at the episode's beginning. The irony that his quest for peaceful jazz appreciation has led him full circle becomes complete when his concrete shell finally breaks, revealing his true identity to an audience that has been enjoying the very entertainment he originally sought. The episode serves as a dark commentary on how losing one's identity can happen gradually through a series of well-meaning but misguided interventions by others. Squidward's experience shows how quickly someone can go from being a respected individual to being treated as a thing to be managed, controlled, and ultimately discarded when convenient. The story also explores how good intentions without understanding or respect for the subject's autonomy can create forms of oppression that feel caring to the oppressor while being traumatic for the victim. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. While Squidward's experience as Smelly stripped away his identity and dignity, his next ordeal would involve being forced to surrender his rational thinking and independence to the arbitrary whims of a children's toy. Club SpongeBob demonstrates how desperation and social pressure can drive even the most skeptical person to abandon logic and critical thinking in favor of blind faith in absurd authorities. What begins as Squidward's mockery of SpongeBob and Patrick's exclusive club turns into a survival situation where rejecting their irrational belief system means starvation and isolation. The episode starts when Squidward encounters SpongeBob and Patrick speaking in baby talk from their treehouse clubhouse, replacing R sounds with W sounds as they announce his arrival at work. When Squidward dismisses this as a stupid secret code, SpongeBob explains they can't reveal it because he's not a club member. Squidward's claim of belonging to over 20 exclusive clubs across the sea bottom demonstrates his need to assert his social status and sophistication compared to their childish games. Patrick's comment that Squidward and his nose won't fit in the clubhouse triggers Squidward's competitive nature, leading him to climb up and prove them wrong about his ability to join their organization. His physical struggle to squeeze into the tiny space while SpongeBob and Patrick frantically try to stop him reveals the literal truth behind their exclusion. There simply isn't room for another person. When they explain they've been stuck for 3 days, their exclusive club is revealed as an accidental trap rather than a deliberate social group. SpongeBob and Patrick's attempt to perform a new member initiation song pushes Squidward past his breaking point, causing him to grab a support stalk and declare his complete rejection of their club membership. His violent pulling snaps the support structure and launches all three of them flying through the air until they crash deep in the kelp forest, far from civilization and any hope of easy rescue. Squidward's realization that he's trapped in the middle of nowhere with SpongeBob, and Patrick drives him to despair as he mourns the misery that fills every 11 minutes of his existence. Patrick's observation that things could be worse because Squidward could be bald with a big nose creates a devastating moment of cruel honesty that deflates Squidward's already fragile ego. SpongeBob's attempts to maintain optimism by emphasizing their club unity leads to the introduction of the magic conch shell, a children's toy that provides random recorded responses when its string is pulled. While SpongeBob and Patrick treat the shell's prediction about SpongeBob's marriage prospects as profound wisdom, Squidward immediately recognizes it as meaningless entertainment. The magic conch's advice to do nothing in response to their need to escape the forest becomes the central conflict as SpongeBob and Patrick immediately sit down and refuse to move or speak. Their instant obedience to the toy's guidance, while ignoring Squidward's protests about the absurdity of taking advice from plastic, demonstrates how completely they've surrendered their agency to an external authority. Squidward's decision to find his own way out represents his commitment to rational thinking and self-reliance. Squidward's solo journey through the forest proves futile as he becomes lost and panicked, running in circles until he discovers he's returned to the same spot where SpongeBob and Patrick remain motionless. His failure to escape through logic and effort, while they achieve apparent success through passive waiting, creates a contradictory situation that challenges his worldview. His establishment of Club Squidward, with a fire and cooked food, represents his attempt to prove the superiority of practical action over mystical faith. The moment when airplane supplies fall from the sky and provide SpongeBob and Patrick with abundant food creates a crisis of belief for Squidward, as their passive faith appears to be rewarded while his active efforts yield nothing. Their interpretation of this coincidence as divine intervention from the magic conch validates their belief system in a way that seems impossible to explain rationally. Squidward's immediate hunger and desperation make him vulnerable to reconsidering his skepticism when faced with starvation. Squidward's attempt to rejoin the club and share their food requires him to acknowledge the magic conch's authority, but his sarcastic compliance fails to satisfy the shell's seemingly arbitrary judgments. When asked about food choices, the conch consistently denies Squidward permission to eat anything while granting Patrick access to the same items. The toy's responses appear deliberately cruel and personal, creating the impression of conscious malice rather than random chance. The escalating series of rejections drives Squidward to increasingly desperate questioning, but the magic conch's final sarcastic "no," delivered in a mocking tone, breaks his psychological resistance entirely. His complete mental breakdown demonstrates how prolonged denial of basic needs while watching others receive plenty can destroy even the strongest will to maintain independence and rational thinking. The arrival of the Kelp Forest Ranger initially appears to offer salvation through adult authority and practical rescue, but his revelation that he also follows a magic conch shell destroys Squidward's last hope for rational assistance. The Ranger's explanation that his shell told him to save them, followed by immediate consultation for further instructions, shows how the belief system has infected even authority figures who should represent competence and logic. When all four characters receive the instruction to do nothing and sit down together in passive waiting, Squidward's final capitulation represents the complete victory of groupthink over individual reasoning. His joining their ranks while maintaining his dumbstruck expression suggests he's aware of the absurdity but lacks the strength to continue resisting when surrounded by believers and facing continued punishment for skepticism. The episode serves as a commentary on how social pressure, desperation, and apparent evidence can force people to abandon critical thinking and embrace irrational belief systems. Squidward's journey from mockery through resistance to acceptance demonstrates how even intelligent skeptics can be broken down when isolated, punished for independence, and presented with outcomes that seem to validate what they know to be nonsensical. While Squidward's ordeal with the magic conch shell forced him to abandon rational thinking, SpongeBob and Mr. Krabs' next crisis would involve paranoia and guilt, driving them to commit increasingly serious crimes in their attempts to cover up a mistake that never actually happened. Nasty Patty shows how fear and misinformation can escalate a harmless situation into a nightmare of criminal behavior when people make assumptions instead of checking facts. What begins as Mr. Krabs and SpongeBob trying to impress a health inspector turns into attempted murder, body disposal, and lying to police when they jump to conclusions about their actions having deadly consequences. The episode starts during a routine health inspection when Mr. Krabs becomes extremely anxious about potential violations that could shut down the Krusty Krab permanently. His paranoia leads him to frantically order SpongeBob to clean everything and change his underwear, while instructing him to charm the inspector with sweet talk. SpongeBob's awkward attempt to call the inspector handsome immediately shows how poorly equipped he is for this kind of social manipulation, causing Mr. Krabs to declare they're doomed. Health Inspector Andy Yellowtail requests one of everything on the menu, prompting Mr. Krabs and SpongeBob to create an elaborate feast featuring items like crusty kelp dogs, buttered barnacles, powdered driftwood, fresh sludge pudding, diet red tide, and fried flotsam. They force-feed the inspector with aggressive enthusiasm, stuffing multiple dishes in his mouth simultaneously, rather than allowing him to eat at his own pace. The inspector's request for them to leave him in peace goes ignored as they continue their manic hospitality. The situation takes a dark turn when a news report announces that a fake health inspector has been scamming restaurants for free food, causing Mr. Krabs to become enraged at the thought of being duped. SpongeBob initially suggests warning their inspector about the imposter, but Mr. Krabs realizes that their guest is the fake inspector mentioned in the news. His fury at being tricked for free food overrides any rational consideration of proportionate response. Mr. Krabs' decision to create a deliberately contaminated Krabby Patty as revenge shows how quickly his anger escalates to dangerous levels. He uses volcano sauce while declaring that the imposter is dancing with the Crabman now, then threatens to fire SpongeBob unless he participates in the scheme. SpongeBob's initial moral hesitation gets overwhelmed by his fear of unemployment and his excitement at adding seahorse radish, described as the gnarliest stuff in the ocean. The preparation of the nasty patty becomes increasingly disgusting as SpongeBob accidentally drops it in the toilet, then Mr. Krabs suggests fishing it out and drying it with his gym socks. The addition of toenail clippings from Mr. Krabs' office creates a burger so revolting that both creators need clothespins on their noses to avoid the smell. Their gleeful naming of their creation and shared laughter shows how completely they've abandoned any concern for the inspector's well-being. When the inspector attempts to eat the contaminated burger, a fly accidentally enters his throat and causes him to choke, then slip on condiment packets and hit his head on the table. Mr. Krabs and SpongeBob interpret his choking and unconsciousness as evidence that their poisoned patty worked perfectly, laughing at what they believe is his suffering and death. Their celebration of apparently killing someone reveals how their anger has completely overridden their moral compass. A second news report reveals that the real fake inspector has been captured and shows his photograph, proving that their inspector was legitimate all along. This information should provide relief and lead them to help the unconscious man, but instead, Mr. Krabs declares that their patty killed him. Their assumption that he's dead, based entirely on his unconscious state, drives them to panic about murder charges rather than checking for vital signs or calling for medical help. Mr. Krabs immediately tries to shift blame to SpongeBob by claiming he fed the inspector the tainted patty, while SpongeBob points out that Mr. Krabs ordered him to do it. This blame shifting continues throughout their criminal activities as each tries to avoid responsibility for their perceived crime. SpongeBob's acceptance of guilt and fear of prison shows how completely he's internalized the false narrative about committing murder. Their decision to bury the body leads to increasingly absurd attempts at body disposal, with SpongeBob treating the unconscious inspector like a contaminated object requiring constant disinfection. When the inspector briefly regains consciousness and asks where he is, SpongeBob accidentally hits him with a rock while digging, knocking him unconscious again. This actual assault ironically occurs while they're trying to hide their imaginary crime. The arrival of police officers creates maximum tension as Mr. Krabs and SpongeBob assume they're being arrested for murder, but the officers only want Krabby Patties for dinner. The comedy of errors continues as rain washes away their burial attempt and the inspector's body slides down the hill into their car trunk. Their frantic efforts to hide the evidence while maintaining normal conversation with the police shows how guilt and paranoia can make innocent people behave like criminals. SpongeBob's attempt to smuggle the unconscious inspector into the restaurant using his hat demonstrates the escalating absurdity of their cover-up attempts. His obvious suspicious behavior while trying to put the body in the freezer forces Mr. Krabs to create increasingly elaborate distractions, including giving away all the money in the cash register. When Officer Nancy requests ice from the freezer, their panic reaches a breaking point. The climactic confession scene reveals how guilt and fear can drive people to admit to crimes they never actually committed. Mr. Krabs and SpongeBob's competing accusations against each other while confessing to murder shows how paranoia destroys trust and cooperation. Their relief when the freezer appears empty, followed by confusion about the missing body, demonstrates how completely they've lost track of reality. The inspector's appearance as a zombie leads to him being attacked by the police officers, adding real injuries to the harm he's already suffered from their imaginary crime. The revelation that he's simply a health inspector who wants to give them a passing grade creates the ultimate irony. Their attempts to poison him were motivated by false information. Their belief that they killed him was based on misinterpretation, and their criminal activities were unnecessary responses to a problem that never existed. The episode demonstrates how misinformation, assumptions, and panic can transform law-abiding citizens into criminals who create real problems while trying to solve imaginary ones. Mr. Krabs and SpongeBob's journey from honest restaurant workers to would-be murderers and body disposers shows how quickly moral boundaries can collapse when people act on incomplete information and unchecked emotions. Their success in passing the health inspection despite everything they've done provides a darkly comic ending that underscores the complete unnecessity of their criminal behavior. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. While Mr. Krabs and SpongeBob's paranoia about committing murder led them to create real crimes, SpongeBob's next obsession would involve an innocent gift that drives everyone around him to the brink of madness through constant noise. Squeaky Boots shows how a well-intentioned lie can spiral into psychological torture when the person being deceived becomes completely obsessed with their supposed reward. What begins as Mr. Krabs trying to recover money spent on the wrong birthday gift turns into a nightmare where the constant squeaking of boots drives multiple people to mental breakdowns and desperate measures. The episode starts when Mr. Krabs tries to impress his daughter Pearl with fishing boots as a birthday present, completely misunderstanding teenage fashion trends. Pearl's friends all wear trendy flipper slippers, making the practical black boots seem embarrassingly out of touch with youth culture. Her mortified reaction and tears shake the entire house, leaving Mr. Krabs stuck with expensive boots that nobody wants and no way to recover his $2 investment. SpongeBob's arrival asking for his paycheck gives Mr. Krabs the perfect opportunity to unload his unwanted purchase through creative marketing. He transforms the ordinary fishing boots into prestigious official fry cook boots, with an elaborate backstory about them being a traditional honor given only to the finest cooks by famous chefs. His vague reference to the previous owner being famous but refusing to name him shows how he's making up the story as he goes along. SpongeBob's immediate excitement about owning professional fry cook boots leads him to offer increasingly generous payments beyond what the boots are worth. His willingness to give up his paycheck, paint the restaurant for free, and provide a year's supply of French fries shows how completely he's bought into Mr. Krabs' fabricated prestige. Mr. Krabs' mock concern about SpongeBob giving him a heart attack barely conceals his delight at receiving far more value than his $2 investment. The boots' constant squeaking becomes apparent immediately as SpongeBob begins showing them off to Squidward, who watches in growing annoyance as the noise accompanies every movement. SpongeBob's interpretation of his new footwear as proof of his official status makes him perform increasingly elaborate displays of his enhanced abilities. His dancing, jumping, and various tricks create a continuous soundtrack of squeaking that disrupts the restaurant's atmosphere. Mr. Krabs initially dismisses Squidward's complaints by claiming the squeaking sounds like money to his ears, revealing how his focus on profit blinds him to the genuine problems his deception is creating. However, the noise quickly begins affecting his own sleep as the squeaking infiltrates his dreams about counting money. His peaceful fantasy of coins jumping into a cash register gets repeatedly interrupted by the boots, showing how his guilt and the pervasive noise are disrupting even his subconscious. The window squeaking in his bedroom represents how the guilt about his deception manifests as auditory hallucinations that prevent rest and peace. Mr. Krabs' increasingly frantic attempts to silence the window, including falling through floor holes and breaking his legs, demonstrate how the psychological pressure of his lie is causing physical harm and exhaustion. His bloodshot eyes and twisted position in his hammock show the toll that one night of squeaking-induced insomnia has taken. Squidward's decision to take immediate vacation rather than endure another day of squeaking shows how quickly the noise pollution has become unbearable for everyone except SpongeBob. His sarcastic reference to the world's greatest fry cook reveals his resentment about SpongeBob's inflated ego from the boots, while his immediate departure demonstrates that some problems are too annoying to solve through patience or adaptation. SpongeBob's elaborate demonstrations of his boot-enhanced abilities, including making them talk to customers and using them to float around the restaurant, and show how completely he's internalized the lie about their special properties. His belief that the boots give him supernatural cooking powers leads to increasingly disruptive performances that interfere with normal restaurant operations while creating constant noise. Mr. Krabs' retreat to his office with seat cushions and chairs over his ears shows how his own deception has trapped him in an unbearable situation. His realization that the boots have got to go comes too late, as SpongeBob's attachment to them has grown beyond simple ownership into a core part of his professional identity. The irony that Mr. Krabs created this problem to make money, but now suffers more than anyone else, highlights how deception often punishes the deceiver. SpongeBob's declaration that he'll never remove the boots creates a permanent problem, as his round-the-clock wearing ensures the squeaking will continue indefinitely. Gary's use of earplugs shows that even SpongeBob's pet has reached his limit with the noise, while SpongeBob's bedtime squeaking indicates that the sound pollution extends into private spaces and sleeping hours. Mr. Krabs' midnight theft of the boots while SpongeBob sleeps represents his desperation overcoming any concern for SpongeBob's feelings or trust. His guilty laughter while running away shows his relief at ending the torture, but his failure to consider how SpongeBob will react to their disappearance sets up the next phase of psychological damage. SpongeBob's tearful confession about losing the boots reveals how deeply he's internalized shame about failing to protect something he believes is precious and historically significant. His repeated apologies and self-blame show how Mr. Krabs' lie has created genuine emotional trauma around an imaginary loss. The oven mitts that Mr. Krabs offers as a replacement demonstrate his continued attempt to use deception rather than honesty to solve problems. The psychological breaking point comes when Mr. Krabs begins hearing squeaking in all sounds, from customer orders to dripping faucets to clock ticking. His auditory hallucinations and distorted vision show how guilt and sleep deprivation have triggered a complete mental breakdown. The transformation of written words into squeak on menus and clocks indicates how thoroughly the obsession has consumed his perception of reality. Mr. Krabs' public confession while lifting the entire restaurant reveals how psychological pressure can overcome all rational self-interest and social awareness. His admission to hiding the boots under the floorboards, followed by eating them in the grease fryer, represents the ultimate destructive culmination of his deception. The act of consuming the evidence literally shows how lies can force people to destroy things they value to escape the consequences of their actions. The resolution through Mr. Krabs explaining that skill comes from the person rather than the equipment provides the moral lesson that should have been offered from the beginning. His acknowledgement that SpongeBob is a great fry cook without any special gear validates what was always true while undermining the entire premise of the boots' supposed value. However, his continued hiccuping squeaks during the vacation shows that some consequences of deception linger even after confession and resolution. The episode demonstrates how seemingly harmless lies can create cascading problems that hurt everyone involved, from the deceiver who becomes trapped by their own fabrication to the deceived who suffers genuine emotional trauma from false beliefs. SpongeBob's innocent enthusiasm for his perceived professional advancement turns into a source of misery for everyone around him, while Mr. Krabs' attempt to recover a small financial loss ultimately costs him far more in sleep, sanity, and peace of mind. While Mr. Krabs' deception with the squeaky boots created a noise-induced nightmare, SpongeBob's next paranoid episode would involve him convincing others to participate in violent interrogation based on a completely imaginary threat. Crabborg demonstrates how paranoia fueled by entertainment media can escalate into serious criminal behavior when people lose their ability to distinguish fiction from reality. What begins as SpongeBob being scared by a robot movie turns into him and Squidward torturing and destroying Mr. Krabs' property based on delusions that have no basis in actual evidence. The episode starts when SpongeBob watches a horror movie called Night of the Robot, despite Gary's apparent warnings against it. The film's premise about robots taking over the world immediately plants seeds of paranoia that manifest in SpongeBob's inability to sleep peacefully. His worried questions about whether his family members and even Gary might be robots show how quickly fictional scenarios can contaminate real-world relationships and create unfounded suspicions about loved ones. SpongeBob's sleep-deprived state the next day at work makes him jumpy and prone to seeing threats where none exist, mistaking ordinary kitchen equipment for robots. His explanation to Squidward about the movie's plot reveals how completely the fictional narrative has invaded his thinking, while his warning to a customer that robots are everywhere shows how he's begun spreading his paranoid delusions to others without any evidence to support his claims. The coincidental alignment of Mr. Krabs' behavior with robot characteristics creates the perfect storm for SpongeBob's paranoia to focus on a specific target. Mr. Krabs' innocent enjoyment of techno music, his use of the word recharged to describe feeling energetic, and his phone conversation trying to remember song lyrics all get reinterpreted through SpongeBob's paranoid filter as evidence of robotic nature. His robot-style dancing to the music provides the final proof that confirms SpongeBob's suspicions. SpongeBob's attempt to test Mr. Krabs using criteria from the movie shows how fictional rules get applied to real situations with dangerous consequences. The tests for humor, empathy, and love all fail to account for individual personality differences or situational factors. Mr. Krabs' practical response to Squidward's terrible joke, his businesslike reaction to emotional manipulation, and his awkward handling of inappropriate workplace declarations all get interpreted as evidence of inhuman nature rather than normal behavioral variation. The accidental convergence of circumstances that make Mr. Krabs temporarily resemble the movie robot creates a cascade of confirmation bias that transforms SpongeBob's paranoid theory into apparent reality. The salt in his eyes creating red burning vision, the tongs in his claw resembling metal pinchers, and the batteries in his pocket perfectly matching the movie robot's description convince both SpongeBob and Squidward that their delusions are justified. Squidward's immediate acceptance of SpongeBob's robot theory and his decision to evacuate customers shows how paranoia can spread rapidly when people abandon critical thinking in favor of dramatic action. His announcement that robots have taken over the world demonstrates how one person's unfounded fears can create mass panic and social disruption based on absolutely no real evidence or threat. The interrogation sequence reveals how quickly ordinary people can resort to torture and violence when they convince themselves they're facing an existential threat. SpongeBob and Squidward's use of rope, hammers, and physical assault against Mr. Krabs shows how paranoid delusions can override normal moral boundaries and transform friends into torturers. Their systematic destruction of his appliances while demanding information about his whereabouts demonstrates how conspiracy thinking can justify any level of cruelty. Mr. Krabs' genuine emotional responses to the torture, including his tears over the destroyed cash register and his expressions of love for his possessions, provide clear evidence of his humanity that SpongeBob and Squidward completely ignore. Their dismissal of his crying and declarations of love as somehow insufficient proof shows how paranoid thinking creates impossible standards where no evidence can ever disprove the conspiracy theory. The revelation that the movie ended with everything being imaginary provides the ultimate irony, as SpongeBob realizes he's been acting on fears based on a story that explicitly revealed its threats to be false. His hasty retreat when confronted with this information shows his awareness that he's caused real harm based on fictional concerns, while his abandonment of Squidward to face Mr. Krabs' wrath demonstrates how paranoid leaders often escape consequences while their followers suffer. The episode serves as a commentary on how entertainment media can plant dangerous ideas that manifest as real-world violence when people lose the ability to separate fiction from reality. SpongeBob's journey from movie viewer to torture coordinator shows how quickly paranoid thinking can escalate from personal fear to organized assault on innocent people. The story also explores how conspiracy theories can spread through social networks when people abandon evidence-based thinking in favor of dramatic narratives that feel more exciting than mundane reality. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. While SpongeBob's paranoid delusions led him to torture an innocent victim, Mr. Krabs' next crisis would involve his greed driving him to commit grave robbery and battle supernatural forces over what turns out to be worthless junk. One Krabs Trash shows how greed can transform minor financial losses into obsessive quests that escalate into criminal behavior and supernatural confrontations. What begins as Mr. Krabs trying to recover money from a failed birthday gift turns into a cemetery heist that unleashes an army of the undead, seeking revenge for theft and desecration. The episode starts when Mr. Krabs attempts to sell his trash as antiques after Pearl's rejection of fishing boots leaves him with unwanted inventory. His transformation of garbage into fine antiques through creative storytelling demonstrates how easily he manipulates customers with false narratives about historical significance. His claim that a broken umbrella belonged to the Queen of Switzerland shows his willingness to fabricate elaborate lies for small financial gains. SpongeBob's purchase of a soda-drinking hat for $10 represents Mr. Krabs' successful exploitation of his employees' trust and enthusiasm. SpongeBob's emotional connection to the hat, which he names Hattie, reveals how marketing manipulation can create genuine attachment to worthless objects. His willingness to exhaust his savings and go into debt for the hat shows how effective Mr. Krabs' sales tactics can be when applied to vulnerable customers. The revelation that the hat is worth $1 million transforms Mr. Krabs' minor profit into a major missed opportunity, triggering his obsessive need to recover what he now sees as lost fortune. The escalating offers from multiple collectors, reaching up to $1 million, create a feeding frenzy that drives Mr. Krabs to increasingly desperate measures to reclaim the hat he sold for a fraction of its value. Mr. Krabs' initial attempts to retrieve the hat through manipulation show his preference for deception over honest dealing. His claim that the hat makes SpongeBob look feminine, followed by calling him beautiful when pressed, reveals how his lies become tangled and contradictory when he's focused solely on his desired outcome. His subsequent offering of multiple replacement hats demonstrates his willingness to spend money to make money, though still far less than the hat's apparent worth. The escalation to supernatural deception through his ghost impersonation represents Mr. Krabs crossing ethical boundaries by exploiting SpongeBob's trust and gullibility. His improvised story about Smitty Werbenjager Mangensen and the cursed hat shows how lies require additional lies to maintain consistency. His frustration when SpongeBob takes the story seriously and decides to return the hat to its supposed original owner reveals how manipulation can backfire when the victim acts logically based on false information. SpongeBob's decision to bury the hat at Floater's cemetery demonstrates how thoroughly he's internalized Mr. Krabs' fabricated story about the curse and the previous owner. His discovery of an actual grave matching the fictional name creates an impossible coincidence that validates the lie through pure chance. This development forces Mr. Krabs to commit grave robbery to retrieve what he believes is his $1 million prize. The cemetery setting introduces genuine supernatural elements that transform Mr. Krabs' greed-driven quest into a horror scenario with real consequences. His dismissive attitude toward the dead, calling them Bone Boy, and telling them to play dead, shows his complete lack of respect for anything that doesn't generate profit. His confidence that supernatural threats can be ignored or intimidated reveals how greed has made him reckless about genuine dangers. The awakening of Smitty's skeleton and the army of the undead creates a supernatural justice scenario where Mr. Krabs faces consequences for his grave robbing and disrespect. The skeleton's simple request for the return of their property contrasts with Mr. Krabs' violent resistance and willingness to fight an entire army rather than give up potential profit. His sword, fighting with a swordfish head, shows how completely his greed has overwhelmed his survival instincts. Mr. Krabs' apparent victory over the supernatural army through combat represents the triumph of greed over death itself, suggesting that his obsession with money has made him more dangerous than supernatural forces. His successful escape from the cemetery with the hat demonstrates how determination driven by financial motivation can overcome seemingly impossible odds, even when those odds include armies of vengeful spirits. The final revelation that the hats have become worthless due to a warehouse discovery provides the ultimate irony that Mr. Krabs' night of grave robbery, supernatural combat, and moral compromise was completely unnecessary. The timing of this market crash, occurring just as he claims his prize, shows how quickly perceived value can evaporate and make even the most extreme efforts pointless. SpongeBob's appearance with a new novelty hat that immediately attracts the same collectors creates a perfect loop where the cycle of artificial scarcity and inflated value begins again. The collector's immediate pursuit of the new prize while dismissing the old one demonstrates how market manipulation and artificial demand drive these value fluctuations rather than any inherent worth in the objects themselves. The episode demonstrates how greed can escalate minor losses into major crimes, transforming rational business owners into grave robbers willing to fight supernatural armies for profit. Mr. Krabs' journey from yard sale operator to cemetery warrior shows how the pursuit of money can override moral boundaries, respect for the dead, and basic self-preservation instincts. The story also explores how artificial scarcity and collector mania can create temporary value bubbles that burst just as quickly as they form, leaving those who sacrificed everything for profit with nothing but the consequences of their actions. While Mr. Krabs' grave-robbing adventure ended in financial disappointment, his next scheme would involve psychological warfare that backfires when his victim discovers how to turn the tables using his own deepest fears. One course meal reveals how exploitation of phobias can become a cycle of mutual destruction when both parties possess knowledge of each other's psychological vulnerabilities. What begins as Mr. Krabs using Pearl's natural presence to deter Plankton's attacks escalates into deliberate torture that drives his victim to suicidal desperation before revenge creates an equally devastating counterattack. The episode starts with another typical Plankton assault on the Krusty Krab, featuring bombs, missiles, and robotic arms designed to extract the secret formula through force and torture. Plankton's use of tickling and physical restraint to interrogate Mr. Krabs shows his willingness to employ psychological and physical torture to achieve his goals. SpongeBob's accidental revelation about the safe behind the painting demonstrates how innocent mistakes can provide enemies with dangerous information. Pearl's unexpected arrival creates the turning point when Plankton's species-based terror of whales causes him to abandon his successful mission and flee immediately. His panicked references to documentaries and his family's historical consumption by whales reveal a deep-seated phobia rooted in both genetic memory and factual knowledge about predator-prey relationships. Mr. Krabs' immediate recognition of this weakness and his decision to exploit it shows how quickly he transitions from victim to predator. Mr. Krabs' negotiation with Pearl to terrorize Plankton demonstrates how family relationships can be corrupted when one member uses another as a weapon. Pearl's demands for mall money in exchange for her participation shows her willingness to profit from psychological warfare, while her refusal to accept SpongeBob's wacky bucks reveals the exploitative nature of Mr. Krabs' employee compensation system. The escalation to Mr. Krabs disguising himself as Pearl represents a calculated campaign of psychological torture designed to drive Plankton into permanent fear and paranoia. His infiltration of the chum bucket through the dumpster and his stealth attacks create a pattern of unpredictable terror that makes Plankton unable to feel safe in his own business or home. The deliberate nature of this campaign crosses the line from defensive deterrent to offensive psychological warfare. Plankton's deterioration over 16 days shows the devastating effects of sustained psychological torture on mental health and basic functioning. His transformation into a paranoid hermit with unkempt appearance, tissue boxes for shoes, and inability to leave his chair demonstrates how fear can completely destroy someone's quality of life and sense of reality. His tears and desperate pleas for the attacks to stop reveal genuine suffering that goes far beyond typical cartoon violence. The nightmare sequence reveals how deeply the psychological torture has penetrated Plankton's subconscious, creating dreams where he's consumed by his worst fears and reunited with his dead ancestors in Pearl's stomach. The gastric acid burning his body while his grandfather casually welcomes him to the family gathering creates a surreal horror scenario that shows how trauma manifests in sleep and imagination. Plankton's decision to commit suicide by lying in the road represents the ultimate psychological breakdown, where death seems preferable to continued torture. His request for SpongeBob to step on him shows how completely his will to live has been destroyed by the sustained psychological assault. SpongeBob's refusal based on his good nature provides the only moral voice in an episode where both main antagonists have abandoned ethical boundaries. SpongeBob's intervention through information sharing demonstrates how knowledge can shift power dynamics and provide victims with tools for retaliation. His revelation about Mr. Krabs' disguise and his secret fear of mimes gives Plankton the means to turn the psychological warfare back on his tormentor. The casual way SpongeBob shares this information suggests he recognizes the injustice of the situation and wants to restore balance. The reversal of fortune when Plankton captures Mr. Krabs and subjects him to mime performance shows how quickly victim and victimizer roles can switch when both parties have exploitable phobias. Mr. Krabs' immediate breakdown and desperate pleas to make it stop mirror Plankton's earlier suffering, demonstrating that psychological torture affects everyone regardless of their usual strength or confidence. The final resolution through SpongeBob's projector trick with fake whales creates another reversal that traps Plankton back in his phobia while freeing Mr. Krabs from his torture. SpongeBob's manipulation of both parties through technology and deception shows how he's learned to use the same psychological warfare tactics that have been employed throughout the episode. His corking of plankton in the floorboard creates a physical imprisonment that mirrors the psychological imprisonment both characters have experienced. The episode's conclusion, with both tormentors having experienced their worst fears, suggests a mutual understanding of psychological vulnerability, though the cycle of revenge and counter-revenge could potentially continue indefinitely. Mr. Krabs' final comment about the mime, creeping him out, shows that his phobia remains active and exploitable, maintaining the potential for future psychological warfare. The story serves as a dark exploration of how fear-based tactics can escalate beyond reasonable self-defense into systematic torture that damages both perpetrator and victim. The episode demonstrates how exploitation of psychological vulnerabilities can create cycles of revenge where each party's suffering becomes justification for inflicting equal or greater suffering on their opponent. The casual treatment of suicide ideation and psychological torture as comedy elements makes this one of the series' most controversial episodes in terms of its potential impact on viewers' understanding of mental health and appropriate conflict resolution. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. While Mr. Krabs' psychological warfare tactics created a cycle of mutual torture, his next paranoid episode would involve him turning against his own employees and customers based on an imaginary threat that exists only in his mind. Plankton's paranoia demonstrates how paranoia can escalate from reasonable caution into complete social isolation and self-destruction when fear overwhelms rational thinking. What begins as Krabs preparing for Plankton's daily formula theft attempt turns into a delusional breakdown that destroys his business relationships and nearly kills his loved ones through booby-trapped food. The episode starts with Mr. Krabs conducting military-style preparations at the Krusty Krab, treating Plankton's predictable attacks as serious security threats requiring constant vigilance. His assignment of SpongeBob to guard duty and his dismissive attitude towards Squidward's undercover sleeping shows how he's begun treating normal business operations as warfare. SpongeBob's enthusiastic patrol with marching songs about Krabby Patties creating chest hair demonstrates his willingness to follow Mr. Krabs' increasingly militant directives. When Plankton fails to appear at his usual time, Mr. Krabs' anxiety begins escalating into obsessive behavior. His attempts to facilitate Plankton's arrival by oiling door hinges, removing customers who might block his path, and displaying the secret formula as bait show how his paranoia has inverted his priorities, from protecting the formula to actively trying to attract theft attempts. His growing worry that Plankton might not want the formula anymore reveals how completely his identity has become tied to being the target of these attacks. Patrick's innocent request for ketchup while holding the formula bottle triggers Mr. Krabs' security protocols, causing the restaurant to transform into an underground bunker with spinning defenses that traumatize customers and send them fleeing. The false alarm demonstrates how Mr. Krabs' paranoid preparations are more destructive to his business than any actual threat from Plankton, as his defensive measures drive away paying customers and create genuine chaos. Mr. Krabs' refusal to allow SpongeBob and Squidward to go home at closing time shows how paranoia extends beyond reasonable precautions into controlling and irrational behavior. His decision to stay overnight, waiting for an attack that may never come, demonstrates how fear can consume normal life rhythms and social boundaries. His camouflage integration into the floor the next morning reveals how completely he's abandoned normal human behavior in favor of constant vigilance. The escalation to physical assault begins when Mr. Krabs attacks an innocent customer, literally shaking the skeleton out of his body while searching for hidden plankton. His interrogation of Mrs. Puff and confiscation of her to-go order shows how paranoia transforms normal business interactions into suspicious activities requiring investigation. The implementation of increasingly restrictive policies, including banning pockets and charging customers for barrel clothing, demonstrates how fear-based thinking leads to absurd and punitive measures. The systematic banning of customers reaches its peak when Mr. Krabs declares war on anyone showing suspicious behavior, including an elderly man saving food for later and a baby with a Krabby Patty. His violent use of the banned stamper and his physical assault on customers shows how paranoia can justify any level of aggression against perceived threats. The lifting and throwing of his entire restaurant to clear out customers represents the ultimate destruction of his business in the name of protecting it. Mr. Krabs' complete mental breakdown manifests in hallucinations where ordinary objects transform into plankton, creating a reality where his worst fears appear everywhere he looks. His retreat to the bathroom to get a hold of himself provides a moment of self-awareness, but his inability to distinguish between his own eye stalks and plankton shows how completely paranoia has corrupted his perception of reality. The discovery that his friends and employees are visiting the chum bucket triggers Mr. Krabs' final descent into total isolation as he concludes that everyone he knows has betrayed him. His anthropomorphization of the formula bottle, treating it as his only remaining ally and confidant, shows how paranoia can destroy all human relationships and force people to seek comfort in inanimate objects. His creation of weaponized Krabby Patties filled with dangerous objects demonstrates how fear can turn someone into the very threat they're trying to prevent. The revelation that the supposed betrayal was actually a surprise party organized to celebrate the anniversary of Plankton's first theft attempt provides the ultimate irony that Mr. Krabs' paranoid assumptions were completely wrong. The friends and family he suspected of conspiracy were actually planning to honor his relationship with his nemesis, showing how paranoid thinking can invert positive intentions into malicious plots. Mr. Krabs' realization about the booby-trapped patties creates a frantic race to prevent his loved ones from being harmed by his own defensive measures. His physical suffering from jellyfish stings, bear traps, and explosive devices represents poetic justice, where his paranoid preparations ultimately harm only himself. The fireworks display created by the exploding patties provides a darkly comic spectacle, where his pain becomes entertainment for the very people he was trying to protect. The final twist of Plankton discovering the real formula left behind during the chaos suggests that paranoid overprotection can create the very opportunities for theft that it's meant to prevent. The destruction of the chum bucket by Mr. Krabs' explosive trap demonstrates how defensive measures can backfire and cause collateral damage beyond their intended scope. The episode serves as a commentary on how fear and paranoia can be more destructive than the actual threats they're meant to address. Mr. Krabs' journey from reasonable security precautions to complete social breakdown shows how paranoid thinking feeds on itself, creating increasingly elaborate defensive measures that ultimately destroy the very things they're meant to protect. The story also explores how isolation and suspicion can transform loved ones into perceived enemies, making genuine threats indistinguishable from imaginary ones. While Mr. Krabs' paranoid breakdown led him to attack his own supporters, Plankton's next crisis would involve his relationship problems escalating into technological warfare that ultimately proves his dependence on the very person he's trying to replace. Computer overload shows how relationship conflicts can drive people to make destructive decisions that sabotage their own goals, while revealing fundamental truths about interdependence and emotional needs. What begins as a typical argument between Plankton and Karen about business failures turns into an attempted replacement scheme that backfires spectacularly when technology proves inadequate for human connection. The episode starts with Plankton defending his latest culinary creation, Spicy Chum Surprise, which literally melts through the pan and floor, demonstrating the toxic nature of his food while he insists it's delectable. Karen's sarcastic response about its potential success triggers Plankton's defensive reaction, setting up the pattern of criticism and defensiveness that will escalate throughout the episode. The arrival of a customer asking for Krabby Krab products instead of Chum Bucket items highlights Plankton's fundamental business problem that has nothing to do with Karen's attitude. Plankton's frustrated explanation to the customer about not carrying any Krabby branded items while directing him across the street to his competitor shows how completely his business model has failed to create customer loyalty or brand recognition. His bitter monologue about people not recognizing decent meals reveals his complete disconnect from reality about his food quality, while Karen's joke about his meals looking customers in the eye suggests the food might actually be alive due to contamination. The escalation begins when Plankton accuses Karen of making him feel 2 inches tall, which becomes literally true when a ruler shows his actual height. Karen's response about needing heels and her reminder that she helps him remember basic functions like blinking demonstrates how dependent he is on her assistance for survival. Plankton's claim that he created Karen from basic components and could replace her easily reveals his tendency to minimize others' contributions while inflating his own abilities. The immediate proof of Karen's importance comes when Plankton's eye starts burning and he doesn't understand why, requiring Karen to remind him to blink. This basic biological function that he cannot remember on his own directly contradicts his claim of independence, but he continues threatening to replace her with computers that might actually help steal the formula. His march away to prove his point sets up the technological disaster that will follow. Plankton's replacement attempts reveal his complete incompetence in creating functional technology, starting with the T119A Compumatic that immediately short-circuits after greeting him. His excuse that they're supposed to do that shows his unwillingness to admit failure, while the SPU-31 that breaks the doorway and leaks water everywhere demonstrates his inability to design appropriately sized equipment. His final creation, obviously a hairdryer taped to a windmill, forces him to produce their wedding photo to justify owning a hairdryer. The wedding photo revelation that Plankton once had hair adds a personal dimension to their relationship history, while showing how their partnership has deep roots beyond mere business collaboration. Karen's confusion about why they're discussing hairdryers highlights how Plankton's defensiveness leads to increasingly irrelevant tangents that avoid addressing the real issues in their relationship and business. The robot uprising, when all of Plankton's creations begin attacking each other, demonstrates how his replacement technology not only fails to function properly, but actively creates more problems than it solves. His desperate plea for Karen to help control the situation shows how quickly he abandons his independence claims when facing real danger. Karen's pressing of the wrong button that triggers a hammer attack on Plankton represents either incompetence or subtle revenge for his replacement threats. Plankton's accusation that Karen's presence makes him wonder how he's still alive escalates their conflict to existential levels, while his claim that she's been holding him back ignores all evidence of his own failures. His fantasy about having the world running to their mothers without Karen's stifling influence reveals grandiose delusions that disconnect from his actual track record of consistent failure. Karen's departure note using computer terminology like logged onto another network and syntax errors maintains her digital personality while expressing genuine emotional pain. The note's postscript reminding Plankton to blink provides a final demonstration of Karen's essential role in his basic functioning, which he immediately needs to use. His declaration that he doesn't need her, followed by immediate reliance on her reminder, shows the depth of his self-deception about their relationship dynamics. His decision to attack the Krusty Krab with his malfunctioning robots represents the ultimate expression of his misplaced confidence. The military-style briefing Plankton gives his robots about not needing soft software reveals his attempt to project strength and independence while commanding obviously defective machines. His positioning of the various robots and his confident prediction that Krabs cannot stop him demonstrates how delusion can persist even when surrounded by evidence of impending failure. The news report describing his machine as diabolical, albeit haphazardly thrown together, perfectly captures the contradiction between his ambitions and his capabilities. The assault on the Krusty Krab fails immediately when the propeller hits Plankton's head, showing how his own creations are more dangerous to him than to his enemies. His attempt to deliver an ultimatum through SpongeBob breaks down due to SpongeBob's inability to pay attention and Plankton's own communication failures. The simplification to Big Boom Boom reveals how his grand schemes ultimately reduce to childish threats when faced with practical implementation. The robot's complete failure due to an unplugged extension cord provides the ultimate anticlimactic ending to Plankton's technological revolution, demonstrating how even the most elaborate plans can fail due to basic oversights. His tearful admission about being covered in the sticky goo of his own folly while being all alone shows how his attempt to prove independence has only confirmed his need for partnership and support. Karen's return to retrieve her keyboard rather than to reconcile with Plankton creates a moment where his assumptions about her motivations prove wrong again. His immediate assumption that she cannot stay away reveals his persistent self-centeredness, while her weary acceptance of another failure shows her familiarity with his repeated mistakes. His apology and admission that he could never replace her represents genuine growth, though his offer to cook dinner, followed by Karen's threat to leave again, suggests their relationship problems extend beyond this single incident. The episode demonstrates how pride and defensiveness can drive people to reject the very support systems they most need, while showing that technological solutions cannot replace human connection and emotional intelligence. Plankton's journey from confident replacement to desperate reconciliation reveals how attempts to prove independence often only highlight interdependence, and how attacking those closest to us usually hurts ourselves most of all. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. While Plankton's technological failures revealed his dependence on Karen, Mrs. Puff's next ordeal would involve her being punished for SpongeBob's reckless driving while discovering that imprisonment might actually be preferable to teaching him. Doing time demonstrates how repeated trauma can lead victims to seek escape in unhealthy ways, while showing how guilt and misguided rescue attempts can make situations worse rather than better. What begins as another disastrous driving test turns into Mrs. Puff's psychological breakdown where she finds peace in prison until SpongeBob's continued interference drives her to complete mental collapse. The episode starts with SpongeBob's most destructive driving test yet, featuring nuclear explosions, demolished buildings, and a chase that leads to crashing through an unfinished bridge into a retirement home filled with fruit punch. The scale of destruction has escalated far beyond typical property damage into genuinely dangerous territory that threatens public safety. Mrs. Puff's flashback to her optimistic pledge about never giving up on willing students shows how her noble intentions have trapped her in an impossible situation. The aftermath of the crash leads to Mrs. Puff's arrest instead of SpongeBob's, demonstrating how the legal system holds driving instructors responsible for their students' actions during official tests. The police officer's focus on arresting the teacher rather than the clearly incompetent driver creates an injustice that sets up Mrs. Puff's prison experience. SpongeBob's casual question about whether he passed the test shows his complete disconnection from the consequences of his actions. Mrs. Puff's initial distress about being wrongly imprisoned quickly transforms into genuine relief as she realizes the unexpected benefits of incarceration. Her mental inventory of things she no longer has to deal with, particularly the repeated refrain of "no more SpongeBob," reveals how deeply his presence has traumatized her daily existence. The progression from despair to manic laughter to peaceful acceptance shows how prison becomes a psychological sanctuary from her real-world nightmare. The contrast between SpongeBob's assumptions about Mrs. Puff's suffering and her actual joyful experience creates dramatic irony that highlights his self-centered worldview. While he imagines her alone and afraid, she's actually singing happily while breaking rocks, making license plates, and lifting weights. Her complete transformation from stressed teacher to content prisoner shows how toxic her regular environment had become. SpongeBob's decision to rescue Mrs. Puff represents his typical pattern of creating problems while trying to fix other problems he's caused. His consultation with Patrick, who immediately confirms that everything is SpongeBob's fault, provides rare clarity about responsibility that SpongeBob ignores in favor of dramatic action. Their bank robbery attempt fails because SpongeBob has no money to steal, demonstrating how his incompetence extends beyond driving into basic criminal activity. The series of increasingly elaborate infiltration attempts shows SpongeBob's determination to help Mrs. Puff, despite her clear statements that she wants to stay in prison. His disguises as rocks, chili ingredients, coat hanger materials, and toilet occupants all fail because he cannot accept that someone might prefer life without him. Each attempted rescue traumatizes Mrs. Puff further by forcing her to see him in places where she thought she was safe. Mrs. Puff's repeated calls for guards to remove SpongeBob reveal her desperation to maintain the one space where she's found peace and stability. The guards' dismissal of her reports as hallucinations creates a gaslighting situation where her accurate perceptions are treated as mental illness. This dynamic forces her into increasingly frantic behavior as she tries to convince others of a reality they refuse to acknowledge. The escalation to Mrs. Puff attacking guards she believes are SpongeBob and Patrick in disguise shows how constant harassment has driven her to paranoid thinking and violence. Her ripping off the guards' faces to reveal skulls underneath represents the complete breakdown of her ability to distinguish reality from her SpongeBob-induced trauma. The guards' decision that she's gone off the deep end confirms their assessment while missing the actual cause of her breakdown. The solitary confinement cell, made entirely of yellow sponge material, creates the ultimate nightmare scenario, where Mrs. Puff cannot escape SpongeBob, even in the most isolated space possible. The walls transforming into SpongeBob's face represents her trauma manifesting as total environmental contamination, where no space remains safe from his presence. This final psychological assault completes her mental destruction. The revelation that the entire prison experience was a dream sequence creates multiple layers of nested reality that mirror Mrs. Puff's fractured mental state. The discovery that she's actually still in the police chase, then in prison stripes with a ball and chain, then being driven by a fellow prisoner, then back in the police chase again, shows how trauma has fragmented her perception of time and reality. Mrs. Puff's final "forget it" response to the continuing cycle represents her surrender to the impossibility of escaping her situation. Her acceptance that reality will continue shifting between various forms of SpongeBob-related trauma shows how repeated exposure has broken her ability to hope for genuine relief or safety. The episode serves as a dark commentary on how good intentions can become harmful when the helper refuses to acknowledge the victim's actual needs and preferences. SpongeBob's rescue attempts transform Mrs. Puff's brief respite into renewed torture, while his inability to accept responsibility for the original problem perpetuates the cycle of harm. The story also explores how trauma can fragment reality perception and how well-meaning intervention can sometimes worsen psychological damage rather than healing it. While Mrs. Puff found temporary escape from SpongeBob in prison, her next ordeal would involve facing the ultimate threat to her career when a replacement instructor proves that even military-grade teaching methods cannot overcome SpongeBob's destructive incompetence. Mrs. Puff, You're Fired shows how institutional accountability can punish dedicated teachers for student failures beyond their control, while demonstrating that some problems cannot be solved through increased strictness or alternative methods. What begins as Mrs. Puff facing professional consequences for SpongeBob's repeated failures turns into a systemic breakdown where even the most extreme teaching approaches collapse under the weight of his unique combination of enthusiasm and incompetence. The episode starts with Mr. Fitz from the Boating Teachers Accreditation Bureau confronting Mrs. Puff about her unusual failure statistics, revealing that one student has failed her class 56 times. The bureaucratic focus on numbers rather than individual circumstances demonstrates how educational oversight can become divorced from classroom realities. Mrs. Puff's defense that SpongeBob is unteachable gets dismissed with the standard administrative response that blames teachers for student failures regardless of context. SpongeBob's cheerful arrival for another driving test creates the moment of truth where Mrs. Puff's career hangs in the balance based on his performance. Mr. Fitz's ultimatum that she'll be replaced if SpongeBob fails puts unrealistic pressure on both teacher and student while ignoring the established pattern of consistent failure. The driving test itself follows the predictable pattern of immediate collision and failure, but this time the consequences extend beyond SpongeBob to destroy Mrs. Puff's livelihood. Mrs. Puff's ecstatic reaction to being fired reveals how thoroughly SpongeBob has traumatized her professional life, making job loss feel like liberation rather than punishment. Her maniacal laughter and celebration of no more SpongeBob shows how completely her teaching career had become a source of suffering rather than satisfaction. Her flight to freedom demonstrates the relief that comes from escaping an impossible situation, even at the cost of losing her life's work. The introduction of Sergeant Sam Roderick as Mrs. Puff's replacement brings military-style discipline to the classroom with promises that no one has ever failed his class who lived through it. His destruction of Mrs. Puff's nameplate symbolically erases her gentle teaching approach in favor of hardcore methods designed to break students into compliance. The immediate exodus of all students except SpongeBob after witnessing Roderick's violence shows how extreme teaching methods drive away normal learners while failing to deter the truly problematic ones. Roderick's training regimen forces SpongeBob to crawl the driving course before advancing to walking, running, and eventually driving, representing a systematic approach that breaks complex skills into component parts. The detailed memorization of every obstacle, including numbered pebbles and specific pedestrians, shows methodical preparation that should theoretically prevent accidents through complete environmental awareness. SpongeBob's enthusiastic participation in increasingly grueling exercises demonstrates his willingness to endure any hardship in pursuit of his driving goals. The escalation to blindfolded driving represents Roderick's confidence that SpongeBob has internalized the course so completely that vision becomes unnecessary. This advanced technique suggests that proper preparation can overcome any obstacle through muscle memory and environmental knowledge. SpongeBob's successful completion of the blindfolded course appears to validate Roderick's extreme methods where Mrs. Puff's gentler approach had failed. The actual driving test creates the crucial moment where theory meets reality and all preparation gets tested under real conditions. SpongeBob's automatic reach for the blindfold during the exam reveals how thoroughly he's internalized Roderick's training methods, but also how those methods become a crutch that prevents normal driving. The revelation that blindfolded driving is illegal highlights how Roderick's extreme techniques, while effective in controlled environments, cannot translate to real-world legal requirements. The catastrophic failure when SpongeBob attempts to drive without his blindfold demonstrates that intensive training focused on memorizing specific conditions cannot adapt to the unpredictability of actual driving. The nuclear-level explosion that destroys the boating school represents the ultimate consequences of SpongeBob's driving, showing that no amount of preparation can prevent disaster when the fundamental problem remains unaddressed. Roderick's heroic but futile attempt to stop the runaway boat by jumping in front of it shows how even military courage cannot overcome SpongeBob's destructive potential. The destruction that follows includes crashing through buildings, running over the instructor, and devastating the entire city, while SpongeBob politely apologizes to each obstacle he destroys. The collision with Mrs. Puff's peaceful painting session represents the impossibility of escaping SpongeBob's chaotic influence, as even her attempt to find serenity gets interrupted by his latest disaster. Her painting of the terrified passengers in the boat captures the universal fear that SpongeBob's driving inspires in everyone except himself. SpongeBob's literal interpretation of the brake command, where he disassembles the braking mechanism instead of applying it, shows how his fundamental misunderstanding of basic concepts cannot be corrected through intensive training. Patrick's pants ending up over SpongeBob's eyes during the final stretch creates an accidental blindfold that allows him to parallel park successfully, demonstrating the ironic truth that he performs better when he cannot see what he's doing. The final assessment that SpongeBob would pass a Destroy the City test acknowledges that his driving skills are perfectly suited for demolition rather than transportation. Mr. Fitz's decision to rehire Mrs. Puff after Roderick's complete failure validates her original assessment, that SpongeBob is unteachable through any conventional or unconventional methods. The destruction of SpongeBob's failure record in the explosion provides a fresh start that feels more like a curse than a blessing. Mrs. Puff's return to her position comes with the burned remains of her teaching certificate and the knowledge that even military-grade instruction cannot solve her SpongeBob problem. SpongeBob's gift of the reassembled name tag that immediately shatters represents the fragility of any attempt to rebuild normalcy around his presence. Her quiet sobbing at the episode's end shows how the brief taste of freedom has made her return to the impossible situation even more painful. The episode demonstrates how some educational challenges cannot be solved through changing teaching methods, increasing discipline, or administrative pressure. SpongeBob's consistent failure across multiple instructors and approaches suggests that certain learning disabilities or cognitive differences may be beyond the reach of conventional education systems, requiring alternative solutions that prioritize safety over achievement. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. While Mrs. Puff's military-trained replacement proved that extreme teaching methods cannot solve SpongeBob's driving problem, her next encounter would involve being blackmailed into working alongside him at the Krusty Krab, where his role reversal as teacher creates an even more unbearable situation. Summer Job reveals how desperation can trap people in exploitative arrangements while showing that some relationships become toxic regardless of context or role reversals. What begins as Mrs. Puff trying to escape SpongeBob for summer vacation turns into her being coerced into unpaid labor, where he gains power over her through workplace training. The episode starts with Mrs. Puff's frantic attempt to escape SpongeBob at the end of the school year, desperately searching for her keys while he approaches with a note. Her panicked flight through the fence and brief relief at losing him shows how completely she's come to fear his presence even in innocent interactions. SpongeBob's appearance directly in front of her face while she's driving demonstrates his supernatural ability to appear wherever she tries to hide. Mrs. Puff's violent reaction of smacking SpongeBob out of her boat while he hangs on for help reveals how his persistent attempts at communication have driven her to aggressive behavior. Her decision to floor the accelerator while he's clinging to the vehicle shows a complete abandonment of safety and concern for his welfare. The note covering her eye during this escape attempt creates the accident that will trap her in an even worse situation. The crash into the Krusty Krab triggers Mrs. Puff's terror about her parole officer discovering another incident, revealing a criminal history that suggests previous SpongeBob-related disasters have led to legal consequences. Her declaration that she'll be sentenced for life this time shows how repeatedly being involved in his accidents has created a pattern that the legal system treats as criminal behavior rather than victimization. Mr. Krabs' immediate appearance and assessment of the situation as a conundrum demonstrates his opportunistic nature in recognizing exploitable desperation. His veiled threat about information leaking to authorities puts Mrs. Puff in a position where she must accept any terms to avoid imprisonment. Her panicked offer to do anything creates the opening for Mr. Krabs to propose an arrangement that benefits only him. The misunderstanding about dating reveals Mrs. Puff's confusion about Mr. Krabs' intentions, while his quick clarification shows he has something more exploitative in mind. The revelation that she'll be working unpaid to cover repair costs while Squidward takes an unplanned vacation demonstrates how her desperation allows Mr. Krabs to solve multiple problems at her expense. The forced nature of Squidward's vacation and Mrs. Puff's sarcastic responses show how both employees are being manipulated. SpongeBob's excitement about becoming Mrs. Puff's teacher creates a role reversal that amplifies the power imbalance in their relationship. His declaration that he'll be teaching her now inverts their traditional dynamic in a way that must feel particularly humiliating for a professional educator. Mrs. Puff's mantra about patience being a virtue shows her attempt to maintain composure in an increasingly unbearable situation. The training sequence reveals SpongeBob's obsessive attention to meaningless details while missing fundamental concepts about workplace efficiency. His insistence on note-taking, sticker rewards, and military-style register protocols transforms simple tasks into elaborate procedures that waste time and energy. Mrs. Puff's frustrated compliance shows how her vulnerable position forces her to endure his instruction, despite its obvious inadequacy. The role-playing exercise with SpongeBob as Duke Thomas Faya de Muffin demonstrates his tendency to overcomplicate simple interactions through unnecessary character work. His constant interruptions to provide coaching while maintaining the character creates confusion that makes normal customer service impossible. Mrs. Puff's growing anger at the ridiculous performance gets punished when Mr. Krabs sides with SpongeBob's absurd demands. Mr. Krabs' warning about losing regularity with customers reinforces Mrs. Puff's powerless position, where she must tolerate any behavior from SpongeBob, regardless of how disruptive or nonsensical it becomes. The threat underlying his words makes it clear that challenging SpongeBob's teaching methods could result in further punishment or legal exposure. The actual customer service attempt reveals how SpongeBob's training creates unnecessary complexity in straightforward transactions. His requirement for written orders, bell ringing, and specific delivery routes transforms a simple patty sale into an obstacle course that nearly kills Mrs. Puff. The barrel accident that sends her careening around the restaurant while SpongeBob provides unhelpful navigation shows how his presence turns even basic tasks into life-threatening situations. Mrs. Puff's breaking point comes when SpongeBob deducts points for her landing after she nearly died delivering his order, showing how his focus on arbitrary standards ignores the real dangers he creates. Her inflation and declaration that the situation isn't worth it represents her decision to abandon the coercive arrangement despite the legal consequences she faces. The littering arrest provides the ironic resolution where Mrs. Puff's intentional criminal act becomes her escape from SpongeBob's torment. Her enthusiastic confession to littering in celebration of her prison sentence shows how completely she prefers legal punishment to continued exposure to his training methods. The calculation of spending 4 years without SpongeBob reveals how prison time seems like a bargain compared to enduring his presence. The final twist of SpongeBob appearing as the traffic school instructor creates the ultimate nightmare scenario where Mrs. Puff cannot escape him even through imprisonment. The revelation that his note explained his summer job as a driver's education teacher shows how her refusal to read his communication led to her current predicament. Her desperate attempt to escape before being chained to her chair represents the complete futility of avoiding someone who appears in every possible context. The episode demonstrates how desperation can force people into exploitative arrangements that become more harmful than the original problems they were trying to solve. Mrs. Puff's journey from car accident to workplace coercion to imprisonment shows how avoiding consequences can lead to increasingly severe situations, while SpongeBob's oblivious enthusiasm for role reversal highlights how power dynamics can amplify existing relationship problems rather than resolving them. While Mrs. Puff faced blackmail and workplace exploitation after her car accident, Squidward's next crisis would involve his irresponsible pet sitting, leading to a medical emergency that transforms both him and SpongeBob into the very creatures he despises most. I Was a Teenage Gary demonstrates how neglecting responsibilities can create cascading disasters that ultimately punish the negligent party more severely than their original victims. What begins as Squidward's selfish scheme to enjoy a SpongeBob-free weekend turns into a body horror nightmare where his failure to care for Gary results in his own transformation into a snail. The episode starts with SpongeBob's loving care for Gary through exercise, play, and affectionate interaction, establishing the standard of pet ownership that will be violated. Gary's slow fetch game that takes all night demonstrates his natural snail pace, while SpongeBob's patient waiting and enthusiastic praise show genuine devotion to his pet's well-being. Patrick's arrival with news about the jellyfish convention creates the conflict between SpongeBob's desires and his pet care responsibilities. Squidward's initial refusal to pet sit Gary based on disgust and indifference reveals his fundamental lack of empathy for creatures he considers beneath him. His dismissive question, "What's a Gary?" and his revulsion at Gary's natural snail behaviors show how completely he fails to understand the bond between SpongeBob and his pet. However, the revelation that pet sitting would guarantee SpongeBob's absence for 3 days transforms Squidward's perspective entirely. The detailed care instructions that SpongeBob provides, including twice-daily walks and specific feeding schedules with labeled cans, demonstrate responsible pet ownership and clear communication about Gary's needs. Squidward's distracted responses while fantasizing about his upcoming freedom show how completely he ignores these essential instructions. His calling Gary Fred reveals how little attention he's paying to the most basic aspects of pet care. SpongeBob's departure with the enthusiastic jellyfishing group creates the moment when Squidward's true character emerges without oversight or accountability. His immediate celebration of being free from losers and his focus on personal pleasure through sunbathing shows how selfishly he views the arrangement. Gary's sad meowing from the window foreshadows the neglect that will follow. The 3-day time jump reveals the consequences of Squidward's complete abandonment of his pet-sitting duties as he emerges severely sunburned from his self-indulgent weekend while Gary has suffered from total neglect. Squidward's horror at remembering his forgotten responsibility comes only when SpongeBob's return is imminent, showing how guilt operates only when consequences become unavoidable. Gary's withered and aged appearance represents the severe physical effects of prolonged neglect, including dehydration and starvation that have brought him close to death. Squidward's frantic attempt to force-feed Gary all the accumulated food at once shows how panic leads to improper solutions that could cause additional harm. His desperate plea for Gary to eat reveals his awareness that SpongeBob's discovery of the neglect will expose his irresponsibility. The moment of SpongeBob's return creates maximum tension as Squidward literally consumes Gary's food to hide evidence of his neglect. His claim to be checking up on old Gary while swallowing snail food demonstrates how guilt forces people into increasingly elaborate deceptions. SpongeBob's gratitude and trust make Squidward's betrayal even more morally reprehensible. SpongeBob's immediate recognition that something is wrong with Gary leads to the veterinarian's visit, which reveals that Gary is indeed a snail requiring snail plasma treatment. The absurd obviousness of the diagnosis, "this is definitely a snail," provides dark comedy while establishing the medical intervention needed. The veterinarian's refusal to administer the injection due to squeamishness forces SpongeBob to handle the procedure himself. SpongeBob's own squeamishness about injecting Gary creates the situation where Squidward must take responsibility for the medical treatment his neglect necessitated. The injection mishap that puts snail plasma into SpongeBob's nose occurs because SpongeBob's nervous interference makes Squidward's task impossible. This accident creates the supernatural element that will transform their relationship dynamics completely. The revelation that Gary simply needed water for recovery makes Squidward's panic about the plasma injection seem overblown, but his dismissive assurance that nothing's gonna happen proves catastrophically wrong. Gary's immediate recovery after drinking water shows how easily his suffering could have been prevented through basic care, making Squidward's neglect even more inexcusable. SpongeBob's gradual transformation begins with subtle behavioral changes like eating Gary's food and making involuntary meowing sounds, followed by physical symptoms including slowed movement and voice changes. The progression accelerates with dramatic physical alterations, including eye stalk formation, limb retraction, and complete body restructuring into snail form. The body horror elements emphasize the irreversible nature of the transformation. Squidward's terrified reaction to discovering SpongeBob's complete snail transformation leads to his desperate attempts to escape contact, including boarding up his home. SpongeBob's persistent efforts to reach Squidward through windows and cracks demonstrate his retained affection despite his changed form. The chaos that destroys Squidward's house during his panic flight results in his own accidental injection with snail plasma. The final scene of all three characters singing together as snails on a fence creates a darkly comic resolution where Squidward's punishment matches his crime. His transformation into the very creature he found disgusting represents poetic justice for his neglect and prejudice. Patrick's angry interruption of their midnight serenade provides the final comedic beat while emphasizing how their transformation affects the entire neighborhood. The episode serves as a cautionary tale about the consequences of accepting responsibilities without intending to fulfill them, while exploring themes of neglect, transformation, and justice. Squidward's journey from selfish opportunist to snail demonstrates how avoiding duties can lead to outcomes worse than the original obligations, while the body horror elements emphasize the irreversible nature of some consequences. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. While Squidward's neglect of Gary led to his own snail transformation, Mr. Krabs' next crisis would involve his paranoid assumptions about teenage behavior, driving him to sabotage his daughter's party and create the very chaos he was trying to prevent. Sleepy Time shows how parental anxiety and mistrust can become self-fulfilling prophecies when protective measures create more problems than they solve. What begins as Mr. Krabs trying to enjoy a relaxing weekend in his underwear turns into a surveillance operation that destroys Pearl's party and costs him far more money than simply trusting his daughter would have. The episode starts with Pearl demanding that Mr. Krabs get dressed for her upcoming slumber party, revealing the fundamental conflict between his desire for weekend relaxation and her need for social respectability. His declaration that a working man deserves to keep his pants off all weekend shows his prioritization of personal comfort over family obligations. Pearl's suggestion that he leave for the night demonstrates her awareness that his presence will interfere with normal teenage socializing. Mr. Krabs' promise to stay upstairs and not interrupt seems like a reasonable compromise, but his immediate violation of this agreement by chaining up the refrigerator reveals his inability to trust Pearl or her friends. His offering of crackers and tap water as party refreshments, followed by ketchup packets as pizza, demonstrates his extreme cheapness overriding any concern for Pearl's social standing. The elaborate house rules sign banning dancing, loud music, and most importantly, boys, shows how his protective instincts manifest as controlling behavior. Pearl's retaliation by locking Mr. Krabs out of his own house represents her recognition that his interference will ruin her party, regardless of his promises. Her confident challenge about what he'll do, followed by throwing his inadequate refreshments at him, shows how his cheapness has undermined his parental authority. The power outage caused by his neon sign demonstrates how his dramatic gestures create practical problems beyond their intended effect. Mr. Krabs' exile to SpongeBob's house sets up the situation where his paranoia can be amplified by fictional media and SpongeBob's naive assumptions about teenage behavior. SpongeBob's excitement about having a slumber party reveals his complete lack of understanding about the situation's seriousness for Mr. Krabs. The movie Slumber Party Zombie Attack provides the worst possible influence on Mr. Krabs' already anxious mindset about teenage parties. The fictional movie's portrayal of teenage destruction, including pillow fights that break furniture and boys arriving specifically to destroy property, feeds directly into Mr. Krabs' fears about property damage. The scenes of deliberate vandalism and money burning create visceral horror for someone whose identity centers around material possessions and financial security. Mr. Krabs' complete belief in the movie's realism, despite SpongeBob's attempts to remind him it's fiction, shows how fear can override rational thinking. Consider SpongeBob's demonstration of teenage destruction using Mr. Krabs' logic, NETS, throwing family photos and crushing him under bookshelves while claiming it doesn't matter because it's not his property, effectively illustrates how Mr. Krabs' fears about Pearl's party could manifest. The irony that Mr. Krabs causes more damage to SpongeBob's house than any teenager has done to his own reveals how paranoia can be more destructive than the threats it's meant to prevent. The failed surveillance attempts using increasingly absurd disguises show how Mr. Krabs' determination to spy on Pearl creates more problems than simply trusting her. The girly 10-girl disguise that gets immediately recognized and violently ejected demonstrates how poorly planned deception usually fails. SpongeBob's fake mustache pizza delivery scheme falls apart just as quickly, showing that surveillance operations require skills neither of them possess. The escalation to dropping a piano on SpongeBob during his piano repairman disguise represents how Mr. Krabs' interference has made Pearl and her friends genuinely hostile rather than simply annoyed. Pearl's preparation of boiling oil for future intruders shows how the surveillance attempts have created an actual conflict where none existed before. SpongeBob's suggestion that they seem pretty trustworthy gets ignored because Mr. Krabs has committed too much effort to believe his fears are unfounded. SpongeBob's honest approach of simply asking to join the party creates the opportunity for Pearl to set a challenge that could resolve the conflict peacefully. Her requirement that he prove he's the most fun person on the planet in 10 seconds sets an impossible standard. But SpongeBob's acceptance shows his willingness to try legitimate rather than deceptive approaches. His energetic attempt with music and confetti shows genuine effort to meet Pearl's criteria. The accident that sends SpongeBob into the root beer cellar creates the transformation that will fulfill all of Mr. Krabs' worst fears about party destruction. SpongeBob's absorption of massive amounts of root beer while trying to have fun creates a zombie-like appearance that coincides perfectly with the horror movie playing upstairs. His emergence as a bloated, dripping creature spraying root beer everywhere provides the exact chaos that Mr. Krabs had been trying to prevent. The genuine terror of Pearl's friends at SpongeBob's zombie-like appearance, combined with the massive property damage from root beer flooding, creates real destruction that exceeds anything shown in the fictional movie. The girls' panicked evacuation and zombie shock syndrome represents trauma that goes far beyond normal party mishaps. Mr. Krabs' discovery of his destroyed house, ruined possessions, and traumatized daughter confirms his worst fears while revealing that his own actions caused the disaster. Pearl's revelation that SpongeBob was the only boy at the party demonstrates that all of Mr. Krabs' fears about boys destroying the house were unfounded. The actual destruction came from his own employee acting on his instructions. Her explanation that they were fine with a nice simple slumber party shows how the surveillance and interference created the very problems Mr. Krabs was trying to avoid. The final consequence of Mr. Krabs being forced to pay for an expensive public party at Goo Lagoon represents the ultimate irony where his attempts to save money by controlling Pearl's party result in far greater expenses than simply trusting her would have cost. His position behind a velvet rope, unable to approach the party he's paying for, symbolizes how his lack of trust has created distance in their relationship, while costing him the financial security he was trying to protect. The episode demonstrates how parental anxiety and protective instincts can become counterproductive when they manifest as controlling behavior and lack of trust. Mr. Krabs' journey from relaxed weekend plans to expensive party funding shows how fear-based parenting often creates the very problems it's meant to prevent, while surveillance and interference can damage relationships more than simply allowing normal teenage socialization would have. While Mr. Krabs' surveillance operation created the party chaos he was trying to prevent, Plankton's next scheme would involve stealing Sandy's most personal possession to infiltrate the Krusty Krab, only to have his plan backfire when the real Sandy arrives to reclaim what's hers. Identity theft and violation of personal boundaries can create chaos that extends far beyond the original crime when the victim fights back. What begins as Plankton's elaborate infiltration plan using Sandy's fur pelt turns into a public humiliation nightmare for Sandy, while exposing Plankton's willingness to violate the most intimate aspects of someone's privacy. The episode starts with Plankton's patient journey, hidden inside a sesame seed on a hamburger bun, demonstrating his commitment to long-term infiltration strategies over his usual direct assault methods. His plan to ride the bun into the Krusty Krab shows sophisticated thinking about getting past security through concealment rather than force. However, his discovery that the burger is going to Sandy rather than staying in the restaurant immediately complicates his mission. Sandy's consumption of the Krabby Patty while Plankton is still hidden inside creates the first crisis as he finds himself trapped in an airless environment where he cannot breathe underwater. His fainting during the eating process shows how his microscopic size makes him vulnerable to situations that would be harmless to normal-sized individuals. The accidental transportation to Sandy's tree dome represents an unplanned detour that will provide unexpected opportunities. The shower scene where Sandy removes her fur pelt reveals the most private aspects of her daily routine, showing her natural body without the protective covering that allows her to survive underwater. Plankton's shock at discovering that her fur is removable creates the moment of inspiration for his impersonation plan. His theft of both the pelt and Sandy's helmet while she's vulnerable in the shower represents a violation of privacy that goes beyond simple burglary to become deeply personal assault. Sandy's discovery that she's been robbed and locked in her own bathroom triggers immediate rage about the violation of her home and privacy. Her desperate improvisation with a coffee pot as a makeshift helmet shows how the theft has left her unable to function normally in her underwater environment. The combination of being trapped, robbed, and exposed creates multiple layers of victimization that fuel her determination for revenge. Plankton's construction of the Sandy robot at the Chum Bucket demonstrates his technological skills in creating a convincing disguise, though his control from inside the mouth creates obvious limitations. Karen's disgusted reaction to the pelt shows how repulsive Plankton's plan appears to outside observers. The robot's stumbling movement and Plankton's poor Texas accent immediately create problems with maintaining the deception. The encounter with Larry reveals how difficult it is to perfectly imitate someone's personality and speech patterns, as Plankton's responses sound unnatural and suspicious. His praise for the Chum Bucket contradicts Sandy's known preferences and creates doubt about the impersonation's authenticity. The need to hide inside the robot's mouth to avoid visual detection shows how precarious the deception really is. SpongeBob's observation that Sandy looks different creates tension about whether the disguise will be discovered, though his focus on the missing helmet and spacesuit shows how obvious visual cues can distract from more subtle problems. Plankton's explanation that Sandy can now breathe underwater provides a plausible cover story that SpongeBob accepts without question. The successful entry into the Krusty Krab kitchen represents the achievement of Plankton's primary objective. The revelation of SpongeBob's labor contract prohibitions against sharing the secret formula shows how Mr. Krabs has created legal barriers, even against close friends like Sandy. SpongeBob's strict adherence to these rules, despite their personal relationship, demonstrates his professional integrity and Mr. Krabs' effective indoctrination. Plankton's frustration at being blocked by bureaucratic procedures shows how legal protections can defeat even sophisticated infiltration attempts. Mr. Krabs' decision to leave the formula in plain sight while cleaning the safe creates the perfect opportunity that Plankton has been working toward. The dramatic irony of the real threat being ignored, while minor security measures receive attention, highlights how security systems often focus on the wrong priorities. Plankton's excitement at finally having access to his ultimate goal shows how close he is to achieving his life's ambition. Meanwhile, Sandy's search for her stolen property leads to public humiliation as residents mock her appearance without understanding her situation. The misidentification as various animals, chipmunk, naked goat, hairless ferret, nudist ferret, shows how her natural appearance without fur makes her unrecognizable to those who only know her covered form. The increasingly hostile crowd reactions force her underground, literally and figuratively. SpongeBob's obsessive attention to minor details like the exact placement of burger buns creates frustrating delays that prevent Plankton from simply grabbing the formula and escaping. The repetitive demands to try again for millimeter-perfect placement show how perfectionist standards can become obstacles to practical goals. Plankton's growing irritation demonstrates how elaborate plans can be derailed by unexpected complications from well-meaning participants. The climactic confrontation between Sandy and her impersonator creates the ultimate identity crisis as the real and fake versions face each other. Sandy's immediate recognition of her stolen property triggers the violent reclamation that destroys Plankton's robot and recovers both the pelt and the formula. Her placement of Plankton in mustard as punishment shows creative use of available materials for restraint and mild torture. The final irony of Sandy being arrested for public nudity, while Plankton receives relatively minor punishment, highlights how legal systems can sometimes penalize victims more than criminals. Sandy's resigned acceptance of prison clothing shows how the violation of her privacy has led to legal consequences that extend her humiliation. The episode's conclusion emphasizes how identity theft and privacy violations can create cascading problems that hurt victims long after the original crime. The story demonstrates how personal boundaries and privacy violations can create far-reaching consequences that extend beyond the immediate theft, while showing how determination and resourcefulness can help victims reclaim what's theirs, despite systemic obstacles and social humiliation. If you enjoyed the video, make sure to subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video.